She didn't marry him for love. She married him to save her brother's life. But no contract in the world could protect her heart from a man like Damien Vale. What began as a cold business arrangement in a Boston courthouse would pull her into a world of shadow empires, deadly enemies, and a truth she never saw coming, that the most dangerous man she'd ever met was also the only one who ever truly saw her. If you've been waiting for a story that will keep you up at night, this is it. Hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments below, and let me see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Evelyn Hart's life broke in half. Not slowly, not with any warning she could have grabbed onto and used to brace herself. It broke the way bones break, one sudden, sickening moment, and then a pain so deep it lived somewhere beyond screaming. She was sitting in the small office at the back of Restoration Path Clinic, the rehabilitation center she'd spent 6 years building on the crumbling edge of downtown Boston. Outside her window, rain came down in gray curtains across Tremont Street, and the city looked like it was trying to dissolve itself. Her desk was buried under insurance forms, unpaid invoices, and 3 unanswered emails from the bank. A half-eaten granola bar sat beside her keyboard. She couldn't remember if it was today's or yesterday's. When her phone rang at 11:47 p.m., she already knew. The way you always know, somewhere animal and pre-rational, that certain phone calls don't bring anything you want to hear. She answered on the second ring. Evie. Her brother's voice was barely recognizable, stripped down to bone, wet with something she'd never heard in it before. Caleb was 26 years old, and he had never once in his life sounded like a man who had run out of options. He sounded like that now. Evie, I need you to listen to me, and I need you not to hang up. She set down her pen. I'm listening. A long pause. The sound of rain on his end, too, wherever he was. Traffic, maybe. Or wind through an open window. I owe money, he said. A lot of money. How much? Another pause, longer this time. She could hear him breathing through whatever it was he was trying to make himself say out loud. Caleb, how much? $350,000. The number landed in the center of her chest like something thrown hard from a great distance. For a moment, she genuinely could not speak. She sat in the fluorescent hum of her small office and looked at the insurance forms on her desk and tried to make the number mean something real. To who? She finally managed. People you don't want to know about, he said. Evie, His voice cracked, reassembled itself badly. It started small. You know how it started small. I thought I could... He stopped. Started again. It doesn't matter how it started. What matters is these people. They don't work like a bank, okay? They don't send letters. They sent 2 men to my apartment last week. They didn't say anything. They just stood outside my door for 45 minutes and then left. Evelyn pressed her hand flat against the desk. She needed something solid. 2 weeks, Caleb said. That's what they told me when they did come in. 2 weeks? Or they start collecting differently. Differently? Yeah. She understood what that meant. She didn't need it spelled out. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of it, the terror, the fury, the exhaustion of a woman who had already been carrying more than her share for years. Their mother had died 14 months ago after a cancer diagnosis that took 18 months and every dollar Evelyn had spent a decade saving. The medical bills had followed her out of that grief like a second shadow. She'd remortgaged the clinic twice. She worked 60-hour weeks. She had not taken a vacation in 4 years. And now this. Where are you right now? She asked. A bar on Commonwealth. I didn't know where else to go. Stay there. Don't drink anything else. I'm coming. She found him in a back booth nursing a club soda he'd apparently switched to on his own, which was at least something. Caleb Hart was tall, dark-eyed, and had their mother's jawline and their father's unfortunate talent for self-destruction. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. There were shadows under his eyes deep enough to fall into, and his hands wouldn't stop moving, picking at the edge of a paper napkin, then the label on the bottle, then the edge of the table. She sat across from him and looked at him for a long moment without saying anything. I know, he said. Do you? Evie. I'm not going to yell at you, she said. There's no point in yelling at you right now. What I need is everything. every detail. Names if you have them, locations, how you got into this, who's involved, all of it. He told her. It took an hour. Underground gambling circuits that had started as a college hobby and metastasized into something with teeth and an appetite. A man named Rourke, who operated out of a warehouse near the seaport, and who had, by most accounts Caleb could gather, never failed to collect a debt in his life. The two men who had stood outside his door were not the kind of men you negotiated with. Evelyn drove home at 2 a.m. with the rain still coming and her mind running calculations she already knew didn't work. She called 3 banks the next morning. 2 said no before she'd finished explaining the situation. The third said they would review her application in 4 to 6 weeks. She didn't have 4 to 6 weeks. She sold the pearl earrings her mother had left her. She sold a bracelet. She called 4 friends and asked without any pride whatsoever for loans she knew most of them couldn't give. She got $8,000 total, enough to feel insulting next to the number she needed. By the end of the first week, she had noticed the car, a black Escalade. It parked half a block from the clinic every morning and left every evening. Sometimes there were 2 men inside, sometimes 1. They never approached her, never spoke, never did anything except exist in her peripheral vision like a threat someone had bothered to make tangible. She told herself she was imagining things. She kept telling herself that until the 3rd day, when she walked out to her car at midnight and found a single business card tucked under her windshield wiper. No name, no number, just an address on the waterfront and the words, "Don't make us come to you." She didn't sleep that night. She lay in her apartment above the clinic and listened to the rain and ran the same numbers over and over in her head until they blurred together, and somewhere around 4 a.m, she arrived at the conclusion that she was genuinely trapped. Not figuratively, not in the way people use that word when they meant inconvenienced. She was trapped with a disappearing window and no door she could find. She was still lying there staring at the ceiling when her phone rang again. This number she didn't recognize. "Ms. Hart," a man's voice. Low, measured, unhurried, a voice that had no need to demonstrate its own authority because it had never once doubted it. "My name is Damien Vale. I'd like to meet with you." She sat up. "It's 4:30 in the morning. I'm aware. I find the hour focuses people's attention." A brief pause. "You have a problem. I have a solution. I'd like to present it in person at a time and location of your choosing. Somewhere public if that makes you more comfortable." "How do you know about my problem?" "Ms. Hart," not impatient, just precise. "There are very few things that happen in this city's financial underworld that I'm not aware of, particularly when they involve individuals of interest." "I'm not an individual of interest," she said. "I'm a rehabilitation counselor with a cash flow problem." "You're a woman who has been operating under observation for 11 days, he said, "and the people observing you don't particularly care about your profession." Another pause. "I can help you. I'd like to explain how. The choice of whether to hear me out belongs entirely to you." She could have hung up. She thought about it, hand tight around the phone, the city still dark and raining outside her window. "Coffee," she said. "Tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. There's a place called Lighthouse Roasters on Dartmouth. I'll be the one who looks like she hasn't slept." He almost laughed. "Almost. I'll find you." She recognized him the moment he walked in, which made no sense because she had never seen him before in her life. He was tall, not in the broad, obvious way of men who wanted you to notice their size, but in the way of someone who simply occupied space differently than everyone else around him. Dark suit, charcoal, impeccably cut. No tie. He moved through the morning coffee crowd without touching anyone, without breaking stride, and every person he passed moved slightly without seeming to understand why. He sat across from her without offering a handshake. His eyes were dark gray, the color of a winter lake, and they didn't so much look at her as take inventory. "You're younger than I expected," he said. "You're exactly what I expected," she replied. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "What did you expect?" "Someone who's used to getting what he wants." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Someone who called me at 4:30 in the morning because he knew I'd be awake and that the hour would make me feel like I had fewer options than I actually do." He studied her for a moment. "How many options do you think you have?" "Fewer than I'd like," she admitted. "More than you're counting on." "Honesty," he said. "Good." He set his own cup down. Then I'll be honest with you. The men outside your clinic work for an organization I have significant influence over. Within 24 hours of our conversation, they can be removed, permanently. Caleb's debt to Rourke can be settled by the end of this week. Your brother will be completely clear with a documented resolution that ensures no one from that organization approaches your family again. Evelyn stared at him. And what does that cost me? 2 years of your time, he said. She waited. Marry me, Damien said. Contractually. A legal marriage with specific written terms. You would live in my home, attend social and professional obligations as my wife, and maintain the convincing appearance of a genuine relationship in all public contexts. He paused. At the end of 2 years, we divorce. You receive $1 million, full ownership of your clinic building, and complete financial independence. No contact after. The coffee shop hummed around them. Someone laughed too loudly near the door. Steam hissed from an espresso machine. Why? She said. I have business interests that require the perception of personal stability. My associates, both legitimate and otherwise, respond differently to a man who has built something worth protecting beyond his financial empire. A wife changes the calculus in ways that are advantageous to me. He said it with the same flat efficiency he might use to explain an insurance policy. There are also specific individuals who will attempt to approach me through personal vulnerabilities if I appear to be without them. A marriage with documented history and credible emotional investment makes certain attacks strategically pointless. You want to use me as a human shield, she said. I want to offer you a contract that solves your problems in exchange for your cooperation in solving mine. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back without flinching, without performing, without any of the social lubricant that most people slathered over uncomfortable propositions. There's nothing romantic in this, he said. No expectation of physical intimacy unless mutually agreed upon and explicitly stated. Separate sleeping arrangements. Full personal autonomy within the structure of the agreement. You continue working. You continue living your life. You simply do it with my last name and a ring on your finger. You've done this before, she said. You've had this conversation before. No, he said, and something in his voice shifted slightly, just slightly. I haven't. She didn't believe him. Then she looked at his face, at the absolute stillness of it, and thought that maybe she did. I need to think, she said. You have 48 hours, he replied. After that, my offer becomes complicated by other interests. She thought for 47 hours and 52 minutes. She called Caleb and told him she was working on something. She didn't tell him what. She sat in the clinic and saw her patients and listened to their stories about addiction and grief and the way a life could unravel through a series of choices that each made sense at the time. And she thought about the men in the black Escalade and the card under her windshield and her brother's voice at 4:30 in the morning, scraped down to something she'd never heard before. She thought about her mother's hospital room, the particular quality of light in it, the smell of institutional antiseptic, and her mother's hand in hers, paper thin and still warm, and the moment she had understood that some things couldn't be fixed and some things could, and that the only thing worth doing was figuring out which was which. She called the number he'd given her. Yes, she said when he answered. No preamble, no small talk. I'll have the documents ready tomorrow morning, he said. I have conditions. A pause. I'd expect nothing less. Caleb gets confirmation of settlement before I sign anything. Written confirmation, something I can verify independently. The clinic stays mine. No interference, no investment, no involvement whatsoever in my professional life. I keep my own bank accounts. My own lawyer reviews the contract. And, she stopped. And I need you to understand that I am doing this for my brother, she said. Not because I'm out of options. Because he's my brother, and I don't leave family behind. That distinction matters to me. Another pause. Longer this time. Understood, Damien said. The courthouse on the following Thursday was gray and smelled like old paper and floor wax. They stood in front of a clerk who looked like he'd officiated 1,000 weddings and felt nothing about any of them, and they said the minimum legally required words, and the clerk stamped 2 documents, and Evelyn Hart became Evelyn Vale, in the time it took a fluorescent light above them to flicker and reset. Damien signed first. His handwriting was precise and controlled, like everything else about him. When he slid the paper to her, their fingers didn't touch. She signed her name and felt something finalize inside her that she couldn't name. They walked out into the March cold without speaking. His car waited at the curb, a black sedan, a driver who didn't turn around. Damien opened the rear door and waited, and she understood that they were going to his home now, her home now, and that a door had closed behind her that she would not be able to reopen for 2 years. She got in. The drive to Back Bay took 20 minutes through traffic. She looked out the window and watched the city she'd lived in for 6 years pass by, and she thought about what she was doing, and she decided she was not going to regret it. She was not going to spend 2 years inside regret. She had chosen this with clear eyes, and she was going to survive it the same way. The building was glass and steel and old brownstone, a renovation that had cost more money than she would make in a decade. The doorman knew Damien's name. The elevator required a key card. The apartment, penthouse of course, she didn't know why she'd expected otherwise, opened into a space so large she could have fit her entire clinic inside it and had room left over. Floor-to-ceiling windows. The Boston skyline spread out beneath them in every direction. The Charles River caught the late afternoon light and held it. She stood at the window and looked at the city and heard Damien come up behind her. He stopped several feet away. "Mrs. Halverson, our housekeeper, will show you the east wing," he said. "Your bedroom, your bathroom, your sitting room, they're yours. I won't enter without knocking." "Thank you," she said. "There's a folder on the kitchen counter with contact information for the household staff, security protocols, and a schedule of events for the next 6 weeks that will require your attendance." "Dinner parties," she said. "That sort of thing." "That sort of thing," he agreed. She turned away from the window and looked at him. He was standing in the middle of his enormous, immaculate living room, and for one fraction of a second he looked slightly uncertain about what came next. She would think about that moment later, that tiny crack in his composure, and understand that it was the first real thing she'd ever seen in him. "Do you want some coffee?" she asked. He blinked. "It's 6 in the evening." "I know. I've been running on coffee for a week. I'm not stopping now." She located the kitchen through an archway and went looking for a coffee maker, because if she was going to live in this place for 2 years, she was going to need to know where the coffee lived. She found it, a machine that probably cost more than her car, and was figuring out how to operate it when she heard him follow her into the kitchen and lean against the doorframe. "Third button," he said. She pressed the third button. The machine hummed to life. Behind her, she could feel him watching her with that same quiet, measuring attention he'd turned on her at the coffee shop, like she was something he was trying to accurately categorize. "You're not afraid of me," he said. She found 2 mugs in the cabinet above the machine. "Should I be?" "Most people are." "I know." She set the mugs down and turned to look at him. "But I chose to be here. I understood who I was choosing to be here with. If I spend 2 years being afraid of you, I'll go crazy, and then neither of us gets what we need from this arrangement." She leaned against the counter. "So I'm going to treat you like a difficult colleague, and you're going to treat me like a professional obligation, and at the end of 2 years we're both going to walk away intact." He was quiet for a long moment. "That seems reasonable," he said finally. "Good." She turned back to the coffee. "How do you take it?" "Black." "Of course you do." This time she was almost certain he smiled. The first 2 weeks in the penthouse were a masterclass in organized avoidance. They passed each other in the mornings like polished magnets, proximate, occasionally acknowledging, but always maintaining the particular negative charge that kept them from making actual contact. She went to the clinic. He went to wherever it was a man like Damien Vale went. They reconvened in the evenings for whatever performance was required of them on any given night, and when no performance was required, they disappeared into their separate wings and the apartment exhaled. She attended 3 dinners in the first 10 days. 2 at his downtown offices, where men in expensive suits studied her with barely concealed speculation, looking for the seams in the arrangement. 1 at a Back Bay townhouse owned by a man named Sheridan, who ran what appeared to be a legitimate private equity firm, and almost certainly ran other things that were less easily explained. She wore the clothes that had been professionally selected and hung in her closet without comment. She shook hands and made conversation and smiled at the right moments. She had spent 6 years managing the emotional temperature of rooms filled with people in crisis, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that these dinners were not so different. Everyone in them was running a performance. Everyone was managing perception. She just had a contract that made hers explicit. On the 11th day, one of Sheridan's associates, a florid, overconfident man named Preston, who smelled like bourbon and imported cigars, cornered her near the bar and asked, with the particular smiling aggression of a man who considers himself entitled to ask anything, how she and Damien had actually met. She'd prepared for this. Damien had given her the documented version, a charity event, an introduction through a mutual acquaintance, 3 months of courtship conducted mostly through her work schedule and his travel. She began to tell it. And then Damien appeared at her elbow, not rushing, not aggressive, just present. His hand settled at the small of her back, light as a thought, and she felt it like a current running up her spine. "Evelyn," he said, and the way he said her name was slightly different than the way he ever said it at home. Warmer, like it meant something. "Sheridan's asking about the Hartnell portfolio. I told him you'd seen the projections." He looked at Preston with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mind if I steal her back?" Preston minded. He was smart enough not to say so. Damien guided her away from the bar with his hand still at her back, and once they were across the room and out of immediate earshot, she became aware that she had not stepped away from the pressure of his hand, and that he had not removed it. She looked up at him. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Preston is a liability," he said, equally quiet. "He talks to everyone who'll listen. Whatever version you gave him would have been edited into something more interesting by morning. I had it under control." "I know you did." He looked down at her, and for a moment something flickered in those gray eyes that she couldn't read. "But you shouldn't have to handle him alone." She didn't know what to say to that. The word alone sat in the space between them, doing something she hadn't expected it to do. His hand dropped from her back. The dinner ended at 11. They took the car home in silence, and the silence was different than it usually was. Less managed, more charged. At the elevator, he said, "You were good tonight." "So were you," she said. The elevator doors opened. They went to their separate wings. But she lay awake for a long time, her hand pressed flat against the sheets, feeling the phantom warmth of his hand at her back, and told herself firmly that this was what the contract looked like. This was performance. She had signed up for it with clear eyes. She believed that for exactly 11 more days. On the 22nd day of their marriage, 4 days before they were scheduled to fly to Damien's private island in the Caribbean for a 2-week appearance that was apparently necessary for reasons he hadn't fully explained, she came home from the clinic at 10:30 at night to find him in the kitchen. Not in a suit. In dark trousers and a gray shirt with the sleeves pushed up, and a glass of whiskey on the counter beside him, and an open file folder that he closed the moment she walked in. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up. For a moment they both just looked at each other, and there was nothing performative about any of it. "Rough day?" he asked. Patient relapsed. She dropped her bag on the chair beside the island. 6 months clean, and then just back to zero. She pulled out the stool on her side of the island and sat down heavily. "It happens. I know it happens. It doesn't get easier." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into the cabinet above the refrigerator and produced a second glass. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey and slid it across the counter to her. She looked at it, then at him. "You're not going to tell me everything happens for a reason," she said. "That would be an extraordinarily stupid thing to say," he replied. She picked up the glass. They sat on opposite sides of the kitchen island at 10:30 on a Tuesday night and drank whiskey and didn't say much. And the silence between them was something she would later understand had been the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for, and neither of them was equipped to stop. On the morning of the 26th day, they boarded a private jet to the Caribbean, and Evelyn Hart looked out at the Boston skyline disappearing beneath the clouds, and felt, for reasons she absolutely refused to examine, that she was leaving something behind. She told herself it was the rational distance she'd spent 3 weeks carefully maintaining. She told herself she would get it back. She was already wrong, and somewhere beneath all her clear-eyed practicality, she knew it. The island rose out of the Caribbean like something a dreamer had sketched and abandoned before adding the reasonable parts. The estate sat on a private promontory with the ocean on 3 sides, white walls and open archways and infinity pools that bled into the horizon. The air tasted different here, salt and heat and something slow-moving that had no equivalent in a Boston March. Evelyn stood on the terrace while their bags were brought in and looked at the water and felt something in her chest unclench that she hadn't known was clenched. "It's..." she started. "Yes," Damien said. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the water too. "How often do you come here?" she asked. "Not often enough," he said. And then, after a pause, "It's the only place I've ever been where the city can't follow me." She looked back at the ocean. The sun was getting low, dropping toward the waterline, painting everything amber. "What does follow you?" she asked. Not strategic, not calculated, just honestly curious, the way she asked her patients things, because she actually wanted to know. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Everything else," he said. They had separate rooms here too, adjacent, connected by a shared balcony that overlooked the water. That first night she left the balcony door open because the sound of the waves was better than silence, and at some point she heard him out there, not moving, just present, and she did not close the door. In the morning, she woke to find a coffee cup on the balcony railing closest to her door, still warm. She stood in the doorway in her robe and held it in both hands and looked at the ocean, and the thought arrived quietly and without drama. This man, whoever he actually was beneath the empire, and the controlled silence and the gray eyes that measured everything, this man had gotten up early enough to make her coffee and put it where she'd find it. She didn't know what to do with that. She was still trying to figure it out 4 days later when he told her the truth about how they'd met, not the documented version, the real one. They were sitting on the beach at sunset, shoes off, surf running cold over their feet, and she'd been asking him something about his childhood. Not prying, just the kind of conversation that happens when two people have been sharing space and silence long enough that questions become possible. And he'd answered, and one answer had led to another, and somewhere in there the walls had developed a crack that neither of them moved to repair. "The night we actually met," he said, not looking at her, looking at the water. "Wasn't at the charity event." She waited. "I had a file on you," he said, 6 months ago. "Your clinic came up in connection with a property dispute in your neighborhood. Nothing to do with you, you were tangential. But I read your file." He paused. "You'd remortgaged the clinic twice. You were 3 months behind on 2 invoices. You were taking on pro bono cases at a rate that made no financial sense. And you were there at 11 o'clock at night, seeing a patient who had relapsed for the 4th time." The water ran over her feet, cold, real. "I had my people look further," he said. "Not for any operational reason, He stopped. "I don't entirely understand it myself. I needed to know who you were." "That's not meeting someone," she said. "That's surveilling someone." "Yes," he said, without attempting to soften it. "And then my brother happened." "Yes." "And you saw an opportunity." He turned to look at her then, and his face in the golden light was something she hadn't seen before. Open. Unguarded in a way that looked like it cost him something to maintain. "I saw a solution that worked for both of us," he said. "But—" He stopped again. And Damien Vale was not a man who stopped in the middle of sentences. "The opportunity existed because I was already paying attention, and I was paying attention because you were—" He shook his head slightly, like the word was somewhere just out of reach. "Because you were the most honest person I'd seen in years. Because in 6 months of watching from a distance, I never once saw you do a single thing that wasn't for someone else." The ocean stretched out in front of them, infinite and indifferent. "Damien," she said carefully, "that's a very dangerous thing to tell me." "I know," he said. "It changes the terms." "I know that too." She looked at his profile in the fading light, the hard jaw, the controlled line of his mouth, the way the sunset turned his gray eyes something warmer than she'd ever seen them, and she felt the contract she'd been holding on to like a life raft begin to shift beneath her. "What are you telling me?" she said. "Exactly. In plain language." He turned to face her fully. The last of the sun was on his face, and he looked, for one moment, like a man who had forgotten how to be afraid of honesty. "I'm telling you that when I made you that offer," he said, "I already knew I was going to miss you when it was over." The waves came in, the sun dropped, the sky turned colors that had no names. Evelyn looked at the man she had married for survival and felt the careful, practical ground she'd built everything on shift beneath her like sand. She didn't say anything, but she also didn't move away. And the night settled over the island, warm and close, and the door that she had promised herself she would never open was standing ajar now. And the question was no longer whether she'd been wrong about Damien Vale. The question was what she was going to do about it. She was still sitting with that question at midnight when her phone lit up on the night table. Marco, Damien's head of security. She stared at the name, confused. Marco didn't have her personal number. She'd spoken to him exactly twice. And Marco called Damien's phone, not hers. Unless. She answered. Mrs. Vale. His voice was steady, controlled, but something moved beneath it like water under ice. I need to speak to you about your brother. The warmth of the island dissolved instantly. What happened? She said. He's safe, Marco said. For now. But there's been a complication with the Rourke settlement that we weren't expecting. I need you to hear me out before I explain it to Damien, because it's going to affect the decisions he makes in the next 24 hours. A pause. And some of those decisions are going to be about you. She sat up in the dark. Outside, through the open balcony door, she could hear the ocean. Inside, she felt the precise cold moment when she understood that the world she'd thought she'd bought her way out of had just reached across 3,000 miles of ocean to find her anyway, and that whatever Damien had been building toward her on that beach tonight was about to be tested against something neither of them had prepared for. Tell me, she said. Marco's voice on the other end of the line had that particular flatness that trained men got when they were managing information carefully, giving you just enough to keep you from panicking, holding back just enough to keep the situation under control. Evelyn recognized it. She used it herself sometimes with patients in crisis. The careful, measured voice of someone who needed you functional. The Rourke settlement went through as planned, Marco said. Payment confirmed, documentation filed, your brother's name cleared from every record we could access. A pause. But there was a third party involved in that debt we didn't know about when we negotiated the terms. Who? A man named Carver. He ran the operation Rourke answered to. Not directly. There were 2 layers between them, which is why our initial investigation didn't surface him. When Rourke's debt was settled, the money should have moved up the chain. It didn't. Another pause. Someone intercepted it. Someone being who? That's the complication, Marco said. We believe the interception came from inside our own network. Evelyn sat very still in the dark. The ocean moved outside her open balcony door, slow and rhythmic, and completely indifferent to what was happening in this room. And Caleb, she said, Carver's people picked him up this afternoon. He's being held somewhere in South Boston. He's not been harmed. Carver is smarter than Rourke. He knows your brother is worth more as leverage than as a message. Marco's voice dropped slightly. He wants to speak to Mr. Vale directly, and he wants the original settlement amount plus 50% within 72 hours. $500,000, she said. $525,000. She stood up from the bed. She didn't consciously decide to stand. Her body just did it, the same way it had learned to do things in crisis. Move, stay upright, keep functioning. She walked to the balcony doorway and stood at the edge of it, the night air warm and salt thick against her face. Why are you calling me instead of Damien? She said. A brief silence. Because the way Mr. Vale handles this is going to depend significantly on where his head is, Marco said carefully. And where his head is depends on what happened between the 2 of you tonight. He paused. I've worked for him for 8 years, Mrs. Vale. I know what it looks like when something shifts in him. It happened tonight. On that beach. She didn't say anything. If I call him right now, Marco continued, with his head where it is, he will make decisions that are about you instead of about the situation. He'll move too fast. He'll take risks he wouldn't otherwise take. A pause. He needs to hear this from someone who will make him slow down. And you think that's me, she said. I think it's the only version of this conversation that ends without someone getting killed unnecessarily. She looked at the darkness over the water for a long moment. Give me 10 minutes, she said. She knocked on the door that connected their balconies at 10 minutes past midnight. She heard him move inside. He was still awake, which meant he'd been lying in the dark the same way she had, turning something over that wasn't operational. And then the door opened, and he was there in the narrow rectangle of light from his room, dark shirt, bare feet, looking at her face. He read it in 1 second. What happened? He said. Not a question. Come sit down, she said. Evelyn? Damien, come sit down. He sat. She told him everything Marco had said, in the order Marco had said it, without softening any of it. She watched his face while she talked, and she watched the precise moment that the openness of the beach, the unguarded thing she'd seen there, the thing that had cost him something, folded back in on itself like a hand closing. By the time she finished, he was someone else. Not entirely, but partially. Like watching a door swing most of the way shut. He stood up and walked to the window and stood with his back to her and said nothing for a long time. "Who's running point in Boston?" he said finally. "Marco has 2 teams watching the last known location Carver's people used." "That's not enough." He turned around. His eyes were flat now, calculated. "I need to make 4 calls. I need to be back in Boston by tomorrow morning." He crossed to the dresser and picked up his phone. "Damien." She stood up. He looked at her. The look he gave her was measured and distant and professional, and it was the look of a man who had just put several miles of controlled space between himself and whatever had been on his face on the beach, and it made something tighten painfully in her chest. "Your brother will be fine," he said. "I'll handle it." "I know you'll handle it," she said. "That's not what I'm asking you to stop for." "Evelyn, you're doing what you do," she said. "I understand it. I watched you do it for a month before tonight, and I know what it looks like. You close everything down, and you move through the problem, and you don't let anything that's not operationally relevant exist until it's over." She stepped toward him. "I'm telling you that I am operationally relevant. This situation involves my brother, my name, and whatever you told me on that beach tonight that now apparently makes me a liability." Something crossed his face, fast and then gone. "You're not a liability," he said. "Then stop treating me like one." They stood in the middle of the room and looked at each other, and the air between them was dense with everything the evening had built and everything the phone call had complicated. "I need to make the calls," he said. "Make them," she said. "I'm coming back to Boston with you." It's not negotiable," she said. "My brother's in a basement in South Boston, and the reason he's there is because of me, and I am not sitting on a Caribbean island watching you handle it from a distance." She held his gaze. "That's not who I am. You read my file. You should already know that." A long pause. Something worked through his expression. Something complicated, reluctant. And underneath both of those things, something that looked like it might, under other circumstances, have been respect. "Stay close to Marco when we land," he said. "Don't go anywhere without telling me first." "Agreed." He made the calls. They were in the air by 2 a.m. Evelyn sat across the narrow cabin from him and watched him work through the hours. Phone calls in low, precise language, a laptop open with documents she wasn't shown, Marco on a continuous line giving updates that she could hear one side of. He didn't sleep. She dozed for 90 minutes against the window and woke to find a blanket over her that hadn't been there before. She looked at him across the cabin. He was on his phone, his voice too low to hear. He wasn't looking at her. She looked at the blanket. She decided not to think about it. Boston in the early morning was gray and exhausted and smelled like rain again, like it always smelled like rain, like the city had decided that was its permanent condition. They came off the jet into a damp 7 a.m., and Marco met them on the tarmac, a compact, dark-featured man in his 40s whose stillness reminded Evelyn of a compressed spring. He and Damien spoke for 3 minutes while she stood close enough to hear most of it. Carver's people had moved Caleb twice since the initial pickup. The current location was a property in Dorchester, a warehouse that had been used before for exactly this kind of thing. Carver himself was operating out of a hotel in the financial district. He'd made one additional contact since Marco's call, reiterating his deadline and adding, as a footnote, that he was aware of Damien's current location and had been for approximately 18 hours. That last part landed visibly. She saw Marco watch Damien's face when he said it, and she watched Damien absorb it without reaction, which was its own kind of reaction. "He has someone inside," Damien said. "Yes," Marco said. "We've been running quiet background on everyone with access to the island property list since 3 this morning. We have 2 names." "Who?" "I want to verify before I say it out loud." Marco's eyes moved briefly to Evelyn. "We should go somewhere secure." They went to a safe house in Charlestown, a narrow brownstone on a residential street that looked like every other narrow brownstone on every other residential street, except for the 2 men she noticed in a parked car outside and the particular lock on the front door. The ground floor had been converted into a working operations center, screens mounted on 2 walls, a team of 4 people she'd never seen before, who looked up when Damien walked in and returned immediately to what they were doing. She stood inside the door and took in the room and understood, with more clarity than she'd had before, what kind of man she'd married. Not in the abstract, not in the way you can understand something intellectually when you're sitting across a coffee shop table discussing terms. In the concrete, operational, this is the actual machinery of what he is way. The room smelled like coffee and tension, and the particular burnt wire quality of people who had been awake too long working a problem that had real consequences. Damien didn't look at her when he moved into the room. He moved to Marco and the screens and began pulling information like it was oxygen. She found a chair against the wall, out of the way of the people working, and sat in it and watched. She was good at watching. 6 years of sitting across from people in crisis had made her fluent in the language of bodies under pressure, the way stress lived in the jaw, the way fear organized itself differently than anger, the way a person's hands told you things their faces had learned to hide. Damien's hands, she noticed, were completely still. She had thought that was composure when she first met him. She understood now that it was control, two different things. Composure was what you felt. Control was what you imposed on what you felt. He was imposing very hard. At 9:30, Marco pulled him into a back room and closed the door. She could hear the murmur of voices, but not the words. It lasted 12 minutes. When Damien came back out, his face was a wall. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her chair. "There's a bedroom upstairs," he said. "You should sleep." "What did Marco tell you?" "Nothing that requires your immediate attention." "Damien," she kept her voice level. "What did he tell you?" A muscle moved in his jaw. "One of the names on his list," he said, "is someone I've known for 11 years. She looked at him. "A friend?" "I don't have friends," he said. "Associates. People I trusted with operational information." "Which is why Carver knew about the island." "Yes." "Who is it?" He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at a point somewhere over her shoulder, and she had the sense that this particular piece of information was one he was still processing. Not the operational implications. He'd have had those calculated within seconds, but whatever it was that lived underneath the operational. The human part. The part that felt something like betrayal and didn't have an efficient procedure for managing it. "His name is Reeves," Damien said. "He handled logistics for the Eastern operations for 9 years. Is he here? In Boston?" "He will be shortly." She understood what that meant. She decided not to examine it too closely. "What happens now?" she asked. "We need Carver to agree to a meeting," he said. "He wants to negotiate in person. He's willing to consider alternative terms if I come to the table without armed security." A pause. "He believes that the situation with your brother gives him enough leverage that he can dictate terms." "Does he?" Damien looked down at her. "He has Caleb," he said. "So, yes." She stood up. Not to challenge him, just because sitting felt wrong. "What are the alternative terms he's proposing?" "Access to 3 offshore accounts currently under my control. In exchange for Caleb's release and a standing agreement that your family remains untouched. And if you give him access to the accounts, then I lose significant operational capital and establish a precedent that I can be extorted through personal connections." His voice was flat and factual. "Which means this happens again. Different leverage, same mechanism. So you can't give him the accounts?" "No. But you also can't not get Caleb back." "No." She looked at the screens on the wall. Maps, financial documents, communications logs scrolling too fast for her to read. The machinery of a world she'd married into without entirely comprehending its weight. "There's a third option," she said. He waited. "Carver wants a meeting," she said. "He thinks the leverage is my brother, but the actual leverage is me." She turned to look at him. "I'm the reason Caleb got pulled in. I'm the reason you made the Rourke settlement, which is what attracted Carver's attention in the first place. Carver isn't really trying to extort you. He's trying to demonstrate that you have a vulnerability." She paused. "I'm the vulnerability. If I'm in the room, the negotiation changes." Something happened in his face. Fast and then contained. "No," he said. "Damien, absolutely not. Listen to me." She kept her voice steady. "I'm not proposing that you use me as a bargaining chip. I'm proposing that my presence in the meeting changes Carver's read of the situation. Right now he thinks you're a man who can be managed through the people he loves. If I'm in the room, functioning, and not afraid of him, that calculation breaks. He's banking on you being emotionally compromised. The best counter to that is showing him that the person he thinks compromises you doesn't compromise you at all. He stared at her. You've spent a month watching me manage rooms full of people who wanted to control the narrative, she said. Let me do it. These aren't therapy patients, he said. These are people who, I know what they are. She held his gaze. I have been afraid every single day since my brother called me from that bar at 11:30 at night. I have been afraid, and I have made every decision anyway, because that's what you do when the options run out. She paused. I am not asking for your permission. I'm asking you to trust my read of the room, the same way you ask your team to trust yours. The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. She watched him work through it, the calculation, the resistance, and underneath both of those, something that looked like a man being confronted with the fact that the person in front of him was not who he'd initially filed her as. If you're in the room, he said finally, you do exactly what I say, exactly when I say it. No improvisation. Within reason, she said. Evelyn. That's my counteroffer, she said. Take it, or I call Carver myself. She watched the disbelief move through his face, and then something that might, under vastly different circumstances, have been the beginning of a smile. You don't have his number, Damien said. Marco does, she said. And Marco respects competence. He looked at her for a long moment. God help me, he said quietly. Not to her, maybe to himself. Let's go get my brother, she said. The meeting with Carver was set for 9 o'clock that evening in a restaurant in the seaport that Carver had chosen, which told them several things about how he was thinking. Public venue, visible exits, a space his people had presumably swept. He wanted witnesses, which meant he wasn't planning violence at the meeting itself. He was planning documentation, something he could use later, something he could leverage. Not a man who wanted blood at the table, a man who wanted ownership of something. Marco spent the afternoon running the restaurant's layout and identifying every exit, every camera blind spot, every position his people could occupy without looking like what they were. Damien worked the phones. Evelyn sat with a legal pad and wrote down everything she knew about psychological leverage and high-conflict negotiation, which was more than most people expected, and then she read through Marco's file on Carver, which Marco provided without being asked, which told her that Marco had already decided she was going to be useful. Carver was 61, self-made, third-generation immigrant, moved up through legitimate construction before expanding into less legitimate territory in the mid-90s. 2 marriages, 1 ongoing. Adult children he apparently had genuine affection for. He had never, according to the file, ordered physical harm to someone who hadn't first tried to harm him. He was methodical, patient, and had a documented history of preferring financial resolution to violent ones. She folded that information away and thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. At 7, Damien found her in the small room off the main operations floor where she'd retreated to eat something and think in relative quiet. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed him. She looked up. He looked like he had 8 hours ago on the beach. Not open, not unguarded, that was gone for now. But he looked at her in a way that was not entirely operational, like she was a person he was specifically seeing, not a resource he was specifically using. We should talk about tonight, he said. Sit down, she said. He sat across from her, the same small table between them, and she thought briefly about coffee shops and courthouse steps, and how many tables they'd sat across from each other at in the time since this had begun. Carver is going to try to destabilize you, she said. Not through aggression. He's too smart for that. He's going to try to demonstrate that he knows things about you that you didn't expect him to know. He's going to use your tells. I don't have tells, Damien said. Everyone has tells. She looked at him steadily. Yours is that you go very still when something surprises you. Not a useful still, the kind that reads as absorbing a hit. If he sees it, he'll know he landed something. A pause. What's yours? I get quieter when I'm afraid, she said. So if I go quiet, it's not permission to protect me. It means I'm thinking. He nodded. He's going to bring up your father, she said. Something shifted behind his eyes. It's in the file, she said carefully. Not Marco's file. I don't know what's in Marco's files, but I know that men like Carver do their homework, and your father's history in this city is documented in enough places that anyone who wanted to find it could. She paused. It was poverty, And there was violence. It's what you came from. He's going to use it to make you feel like you're still that kid, not the man you built yourself into. The stillness that came over him then was the kind she'd described, the absorbing a hit kind. She watched him recognize it and actively replace it with something more controlled. "You read further than I expected," he said. "I read what was relevant," she said. A long pause. "My father drank," he said. It came out flat and practiced, the way things did when you'd made yourself say them enough times that the emotional core had been sanded off. He had debts, not the underground kind, the ordinary kind, the kind that gets you evicted and humiliated but doesn't get you killed. He looked at his hands. "I watched him negotiate with landlords and bill collectors from the time I was 7. I learned what it looked like when a man had no leverage and was trying to pretend otherwise." A pause. "I decided I would never be in that position. And Carver wants to put you there," she said. "He can try," Damien said. "Don't let him see you try not to let him," she said. "That's the part that matters." He looked at her across the small table. "You're coaching me," he said. "Is that a problem?" Something worked through his expression. "No one has ever—" He stopped. "Say it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "No one has ever looked at me and seen the parts that need coaching," he said. "They see the result. The thing I built." He paused. "You see the architecture." She held his gaze. "That's my job," she said. "I see people." The restaurant was exactly what Marco's layout had promised. Polished surfaces, good sight lines, a private room in the back that Carver had arranged ahead of time. They arrived at 8:50. Marco's people were already in position. Carver was already inside. He was smaller than she'd expected from the file. Compact, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had been used to getting its own way for so long that the expectation had become structural. He stood when they entered, which was a calculation in itself. It said he was willing to perform civility as long as he held the underlying power. His eyes went to her immediately. "Mrs. Vale," he said. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," she said pleasantly, and sat down before anyone invited her to. She watched Carver recalibrate. It was small, a fraction of a second, but it was there. He'd prepared for a Damien who was protective and reactive. He hadn't prepared for a Damien who walked in with his wife sitting down without his permission. Damien sat beside her. Their arms nearly touched. The negotiation lasted 90 minutes, and she did not speak for most of it. She sat with her hands in her lap and watched Carver's face and listened to the language of the room. The way Carver pushed, the way Damien didn't give ground, the particular pressure point Carver tried twice around the offshore accounts, the way Damien redirected without appearing to redirect. Carver brought up his father at the 40-minute mark. She felt Damien's arm, 2 inches from hers, go absolutely still. She moved her hand under the table and pressed it briefly against his forearm. 1 second, 2, not visible to anyone across the table. He breathed, his arm relaxed. He responded to Carver's comment about the Vale family's history in South Boston without a single visible tell. Carver blinked, moved on. She felt under the table Damien's hand find hers and hold it. She let him. The agreement they left with was not everything. Caleb's release, confirmed by Marco's team within 30 minutes, which was the non-negotiable floor. A financial arrangement that Carver could represent as a partial win, which meant he'd have less reason to come back for more. A standing agreement, documented, witnessed, that Carver's operation would not move against Damien's network for a period of 2 years in exchange for access to one specific account, not 3, which Damien had apparently set up for exactly this kind of expendable purpose. The traitor, Reeves, was not at the table. She didn't ask what had happened to Reeves. Some things she had decided, clearly and practically, that she did not need to know. They walked out of the restaurant at 11:15 into the Boston night, cool and damp and smelling like rain that had just stopped. Caleb was at the safe house. Marco had him there within 40 minutes of the agreement, thin, exhausted, sporting a bruise on his left cheekbone that made Evelyn's hands tighten at her sides. He stood up when she walked in and she crossed the room and held on to her brother for a long moment, his arms tight around her, his face against her shoulder, and she felt him shaking with the specific tremor of someone who'd been holding it together past the point where holding it together was possible. "I'm okay," he said, against her shoulder. "I know," she said. "I've got you." Over his shoulder, she saw Damien standing in the doorway of the room. He was watching them. His face had something in it she couldn't entirely read. Not calculation, not assessment, something older and quieter than either of those. She met his eyes. He looked away first. An hour later, Caleb was fed and sleeping in a back room. Marco's team was running post-operation review. The adrenaline that had carried her through the day had dropped completely, and she felt the weight of all of it hit her at once. The island, the phone call, the flight, the negotiation, the moment under the table when his hand had found hers. She was sitting on the edge of a chair in the front room, empty coffee cup beside her, when Damien came and sat down. Not across from her this time. Beside her. Close enough that their arms were nearly touching again. He didn't say anything for a long moment. "Thank you," he said finally. "You would have managed it without me," she said. "Yes," he said, "but I wouldn't have managed it as well." A pause. "The moment with my father, I would have shown him something." "You caught it," she said. You gave me something to hold on to," he said. The room was quiet around them. The screens on the wall had gone to standby. Someone in the back was running water. She looked at his profile. The hard jaw, the controlled line of his mouth, the particular exhaustion of a man who had been braced for impact all day and had finally been allowed to stop. "What happens now?" she said. Not about the operation. Not about Carver. She let the question sit between them and mean what it meant. He turned to look at her. His eyes in the low light of the room were not flat and not calculated. They were the eyes from the beach, the ones that cost him something to show. "I don't know," he said. "I've never—" He stopped, pressed his mouth together. "The contract exists," he said. "The terms are the terms." "Yes," she said. "And everything that's happened in the last—" "Yes," she said again. "What does that mean?" he said, quietly. Not a negotiation, just a question. Maybe the first purely honest question she'd heard from him. She looked at him for a long moment. "It means," she said slowly, "that I think we should stop pretending the contract is the only thing happening." He was very still. "And I think you know that too," she said. "And I think that terrifies you more than Carver did." A long silence. "Yes," he said. "Me too," she said. They sat in the quiet of the safe house in the middle of the Boston night, two people on the edge of something neither of them had agreed to and neither of them could step back from anymore. And somewhere in the back room, her brother slept. And outside, the rain began again. And the contract that had started everything sat between them, suddenly, irrevocably, not as a structure, but as a question neither of them could answer yet. What do you do when you chose something for survival and it became something else entirely? The answer, Evelyn was beginning to understand, was going to cost them both something they hadn't budgeted for. The only question left was whether they were willing to pay it. 3 days after the Carver negotiation, the contract was still on the table. Not literally. The actual document lived in a fireproof safe in Damien's study, filed between two other documents she'd never been shown and hadn't asked about. But it was on the table in the way that things are on the table when two people have decided, by mutual and unspoken agreement, to let something sit rather than force it to a resolution neither of them is ready for. They moved back into the penthouse. Caleb stayed for 2 nights, long enough for the bruise on his cheekbone to yellow at the edges, long enough for Evelyn to have 3 separate conversations with him that ranged from exhausted relief to the particular quiet fury she felt toward him for putting himself in the position in the first place. She didn't yell. She never yelled. But she said the things that needed saying in the clear, direct language she'd learned to use with people who needed to hear hard truths without being handed a way out of them. Caleb listened. He looked at his hands. He said, "I know," in the voice of someone who meant it rather than someone who was performing contrition. And she believed him, which was the only reason the conversation ended without permanent damage. On the morning of the second day, she found Damien and Caleb in the kitchen. Not arguing, not performing for her benefit, just sitting across from each other with coffee, Damien with the morning's financial reports open on his laptop, Caleb with both hands wrapped around his mug, and some kind of conversation happening that stopped when she appeared in the doorway. Not guiltily, but with the particular pause of two people who had reached a natural break. She looked at them both. Should I be concerned? She said. No, Damien said. Definitely not, Caleb said, approximately half a second later, which was exactly the timing of someone being sincere. She poured coffee and sat down and did not ask what they'd been talking about. Some things were allowed to exist without her management. Caleb left on the third morning. He hugged her at the elevator, tight and real, and said into her hair, "He's not what I thought he was going to be." She didn't respond to that. He pulled back and looked at her face with the particular perception of someone who had grown up watching her manage her expressions, and said, "Evie, you know that's allowed, right?" "Get on the elevator," she said. He got on the elevator. He was smiling when the doors closed. She stood in the penthouse entryway for a moment after he was gone and felt the changed quality of the silence, the apartment recalibrating to 2 people instead of 3. She heard Damien behind her in the kitchen, the sound of a cup being set down, papers moving. She went back to the kitchen. He looked up. They looked at each other across the kitchen island that had become, over weeks of late nights and careful conversation, the geographic center of whatever this was. "He's going to be all right," Damien said. "Yes," she said. "I've arranged for him to meet with someone at Harland Group next week. Entry-level financial analysis. It's legitimate work. The pay is reasonable, and the environment doesn't have the particular characteristics that led to his previous problem." She stared at him. "You got my brother a job," she said. "I suggested an introduction," he said carefully. "Whether he pursues it is his decision." She kept staring at him. He picked up his coffee and looked at the window. "It seemed practical," he said. "Damien." "It's not a gesture," he said. "It's logistics." "It's a gesture," she said. He said nothing, which was its own kind of confirmation. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who arranged employment for her brother and called it logistics, who put a blanket over her on a private jet and never mentioned it, who held her hand under a negotiating table and then acted for 3 days like it hadn't happened. "We need to talk," she said. "I know," he said. "Not about the contract," she said. "About what happens after the contract. What this—" She gestured at the space between them. "What this actually is." He set his cup down. He looked at her with the gray eyes that she had learned over weeks to read in increasingly fine resolution. What she saw in them now was not resistance. It was something closer to the expression she'd seen on his face in the Charlestown safe house. That particular look of a man who has been confronted with a feeling he doesn't have an efficient procedure for managing. "I think," he started. His phone rang. Not his regular phone, the secondary one, the one that lived in his jacket pocket and had a different ringtone, lower and shorter. She had learned in the past weeks that when that phone rang, the conversation stopped. He looked at the screen. Something moved through his face. He answered. "Yes." She watched his face while he listened. She had become good at reading the side of a conversation she couldn't hear. 6 years of watching people respond to news they'd hoped wouldn't come had given her a calibration that was, by now, almost involuntary. What she read was not the controlled stillness of a man managing operational information. What she read was the specific compression of someone receiving something they had not calculated for. "When?" he said, listened. "Where is he now?" Listened. "Don't move him. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up. He stood at the kitchen island with his hand still on the phone and looked at a point on the counter that was not anything, just a point, just a surface. And she watched him recalibrate from the inside out, the same way she'd watched him do it at the negotiating table. Except this time there was no table to anchor him, and whatever the phone call had contained was not something he was processing as efficiently as he normally processed things. "What happened?" she said. He looked up. "Reeves," he said. The name landed in the room like something thrown. She had not asked about Reeves. She had made a decision 3 days ago in the immediate aftermath of the Carver situation that there were operational realities she did not need to be the keeper of. Reeves, the man who had fed Carver information about the island, about her brother, about Damien's location, Reeves, whom Marco had named and Damien had not discussed further, had been one of those realities. "I thought he was handled," she said. "So did I," Damien said. He was already moving toward the hallway. She pushed off the counter and followed him. "He's alive," Damien said, pulling his jacket from the hook by the door. "Marco had him secured at a property in Waltham. Standard procedure, pending my decision about how to handle it." He stopped with his hand on the door. He was not looking at her. He escaped this morning, took 2 of Marco's people with him, not as hostages. A pause. They were working with him. The apartment felt very quiet. How many people knew about Waltham, she said. 6, he said, plus the 2 who apparently weren't who I thought they were. So there's more than one leak. There was, he said. Past tense. I know who the others are now. She looked at him. What does Reeves do with his freedom? Damien finally turned to face her. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he'd been trying to walk back from and had just been pushed forward over the lip of anyway. He goes to the people who paid him to be inside my operation in the first place, he said, and he tells them everything he knows. A pause. Including that the Carver negotiation happened, including the terms, including the financial account I used to close the deal. His jaw tightened, including that I have a wife. The particular weight of that last word sat in the air between them. Who paid him? She said. A man named Aldrich Voss, Damien said. He runs the Eastern European operations that my network has been in competition with for 4 years. He doesn't negotiate. He doesn't want accounts or agreements. He looked at her steadily. He wants the network gone. And the fastest way to destroy a network is to destroy the man at the center of it. Through the people he cares about, she said. Yes. She looked at him. Then this isn't over, she said. No, he said. It's only beginning. He left. She stood in the entry hall of the penthouse and felt the shape of what was coming arrange itself in her mind with the cold, clarifying precision of someone whose particular psychological training had always been less about comfort and more about seeing things accurately. Carver had been a pressure test. Reeves had been a warning. Aldrich Voss was the actual threat, the one that had existed beneath the surface of everything, the one that Reeves had been feeding for however long he'd been inside Damien's network, the one that had used her brother and the Rourke debt as a mechanism to surface Damien's vulnerabilities before making its actual move. She called Marco. He answered on the second ring, which told her he'd been expecting her call. Tell me about Voss, she said. A pause. Mr. Vale wouldn't want— I'm not asking what Mr. Vale wants, she said. I'm asking you to tell me about Voss. Another pause. Longer. She could hear him making a decision. He's been building toward a takeover of Damien's Eastern operations for approximately 18 months, Marco said. He's methodical. He doesn't move until he's removed as many variables as possible. A pause. Reeves being inside the network for 9 years was not an accident. Voss plants people. He waits. He lets time do the work of building trust. 9 years, she said. Yes. She sat down on the entry bench. 9 years. Damien had trusted this man with operational information for 9 years, and for some portion of that, she didn't know how large a portion, and that was the worst part, he had been feeding that information to someone who wanted to dismantle everything Damien had built. What does Voss want immediately? She said. Not the long game. Right now. What's his first move now that Reeves is free and talking? He'll want to establish that Damien is exposed, Marco said. Publicly. In the community they operate in, perception is leverage. If Voss can demonstrate that Damien's organization has been penetrated and that his personal life has become a vulnerability, key financial partners will begin to withdraw. Operations will stall. Then Voss moves in to fill the space. How does he establish it publicly? A pause. You, Marco said. She closed her eyes briefly. He uses me, she said. How? We don't know yet, Marco said. But you should understand that your presence in Damien's life, and particularly your presence at the Carver negotiation, which Reeves knew about, has made you a visible piece of the architecture. His voice was careful and factual. Voss will use the most visible piece. She opened her eyes. Thank you, Marco, she said. Mrs. Vale. He paused. You should stay in the building today. I have patients, she said. I know. I'm sending 2 people to the clinic. Another pause. This is not optional. She thought about arguing. She thought about the 6 years she'd spent building that clinic and the people inside it today who needed her. And then she thought about what Marco had just told her, and she made the call that the person she was right now, inside this situation, inside this marriage, inside whatever was building between her and Damien, Required. Fine, she said. But they stay outside. My patients don't need. Understood, Marco said. Outside. She went to the clinic. She saw her patients. She did the work that had kept her sane for 6 years, sitting across from people who were fighting hard battles with the parts of themselves that didn't want to be fought, listening with her whole body, being present in the way that presence is the only real tool available in that room. At noon, she got a text from a number she didn't recognize. You should ask your husband about Geneva. She stared at the message. She replied, Who is this? No response. She called Damien. It went to voicemail. She called Marco. Geneva, she said when he picked up. Silence. Not the silence of someone who didn't know what she was talking about. The silence of someone deciding how much to say. Marco, she said, I just received a text from an unknown number telling me to ask Damien about Geneva. Either you tell me what that means or I start finding out on my own. A long pause. Come back to the penthouse, Marco said. Damien will be there in an hour. This should come from him. Marco, please, he said, which was not a word she had heard him use before. She went back to the penthouse. She sat at the kitchen island with a coffee she didn't drink and waited for an hour that felt like 4. She turned the word over and over, Geneva, and tried to place it in the architecture of what she knew about Damien's operation, and found nothing, which was itself a finding. He came in at 2:15. He saw her face and stopped. Who told you? He said. Unknown number, she said. Text, 1 line, ask your husband about Geneva. He crossed the room. He didn't sit. He stood on his side of the island with his hands flat on the counter, and he looked at her with the eyes she'd learned to read in fine resolution, and what she saw in them was the specific expression she had not seen since that first morning at the coffee shop, the expression of a man deciding how much to give. Tell me, she said. All of it. Geneva is where Voss operates his central financial structure, Damien said. It's also where I have been running a parallel operation for 14 months, with the objective of dismantling his network from the inside before he could do the same to mine. He paused. It required a level of access that took 2 years to build. She waited. 3 months ago, he said, we were close, enough to move, but to get the final access required, a specific class of accounts, the ones Voss uses to fund his placement operations, we needed a mechanism he wouldn't flag. He pressed his mouth together. The mechanism we used was a financial entity established under the name of a recently married woman with a clean record, significant professional credibility, and no documented ties to organized operations. The kitchen was very, very quiet. She looked at him. My name, she said. He said nothing. You used my name, she said. A company registered in my attorney's office, he said. A holding entity. Your name as a figurehead director. It's not. Don't tell me it's not what it sounds like, she said. Her voice was entirely level. She was using every piece of professional self-regulation she had ever built, because the alternative was something she did not want to be in this kitchen. Walk me through exactly what it is, he told her. The company had been registered 4 months before he'd approached her at that coffee shop. It had been established in anticipation of the marriage contract, because the marriage contract had not been born from opportunity when her brother's situation arose. It had been planned. The specific type of legal entity required for the Geneva operation needed a co-director with particular characteristics. Damien had built a profile of the ideal candidate. His people had identified several possibilities. Evelyn Hart had scored highest on every metric. Her brother's debt to Rourke had been a circumstance Damien's people had become aware of through routine monitoring of the underground networks they tracked. It was real. The threat to Caleb was real. The money to settle it was real. But Damien had known about the debt before Caleb ever called her. He had known for 11 days. He had waited until she was desperate enough to say yes before he walked into her clinic. She sat with that for a moment. She let it be fully real in her mind before she responded, because she had learned over years of sitting with people in their worst moments that the first response was never the truest one, and that the truest one required space to arrive. The watching, she said. The 6 months before. The file. Yes, he said. That wasn't. She stopped, started again. When you told me on the beach that you'd been watching me, that it started as something else and became something you didn't plan. Was any of that true? He looked at her. Yes, he said. All of it. But you still used my name without asking me. Yes. You still built a plan around my desperation without telling me about it. Yes. You told me on the beach that you'd never had this conversation before, that you'd never made this offer to anyone else. That was true, he said. The offer I made you, the contract, that was specific to you. Every other element of the arrangement was built around who you are, not just what I needed. That's not exculpatory, she said. I know, he said. She stood up. She needed to not be sitting. She walked to the window, their window, the one with the Boston skyline that she'd stood at on her first night here and felt the door close behind her. And she looked at the city and breathed. What does Geneva mean for me right now? She said. Legally, concretely. He was quiet for a moment. The company was established legally. There's no criminal exposure for you. The entity hasn't been used for anything that would create liability on your part. Yet, she said. The operation concluded successfully 3 weeks ago, he said. The accounts were accessed. Voss's funding structure was significantly damaged. He can't run his placement operations for the next 12 to 18 months. A pause. That's why he's moving now. Not because he's strong. Because he's injured and trying to reestablish position before I can consolidate the advantage. She turned around. So you damaged him, she said, using my name without telling me. And now he knows, because Reeves told him. And so the text I received today is Voss's people beginning to use me as leverage against you. Yes, he said. She looked at him across the room. He stood at the kitchen island with his hand still flat on the counter, and he looked back at her, and he did not attempt to manage her response or position himself advantageously within it. He just stood there and let it be what it was. That, she thought with a very tired and fractured clarity, was the most honest thing he had ever done for her. It didn't make it better. I need you to leave the apartment, she said. Something crossed his face. Evelyn? I'm not ending anything, she said. I'm not making any decisions right now. I just need you to not be in this space for a few hours while I... She stopped, pressed her fingers against her mouth briefly. While I figure out who I am inside this. He looked at her for a long moment. Marco will be outside, he said. I know. He picked up his jacket. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on it. Everything I said on the beach, he said without turning around. Everything that happened in that safe house. In the car. In the kitchen at 4 a.m. A pause. None of that was the operation. She didn't respond. He left. She stood at the window for a long time after the elevator closed. The city moved below her, indifferent and continuous. Somewhere across that city, Reeves was with Voss's people. Somewhere, Voss was making decisions about how to use her name and her visibility and her proximity to Damien to restore what he'd lost. She thought about the moment on the beach, the specific quality of light on his face, the way he'd said, I already knew I was going to miss you when it was over. She had felt, in that moment, that she was seeing something real. She still believed she'd been seeing something real. She also believed that a man could do something real and still have done something wrong. Those two things were not mutually exclusive. She'd spent 6 years with patients who needed to understand that the people who had hurt them could have been genuine and still have been harmful, and that understanding one thing didn't cancel out the other. She was at her desk in the second bedroom she used as a workspace, running through what she knew about Voss's operational patterns from the file Marco had given her when her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered it. Mrs. Vale, said a voice she didn't recognize. Male, accented. Eastern European, she thought, though not heavily. I believe you received my earlier message. She kept her voice completely steady. What do you want? A conversation, the voice said. In person, tonight. I don't meet strangers in person, she said. You met Damien Vale in person, the voice said, and look how that turned out. A pause. I have information about what your husband has been doing with your name that I believe you deserve to know in full. Things he will not tell you. Another pause. I also have a proposition that would benefit you significantly. All you need to do is listen. If you have something to say to me, she said, say it now. Some things require a room, he said, and some things require a pause. The kind of privacy that ensures Damien's security team isn't listening. She looked at the wall in front of her. She thought about Marco outside the door. She thought about the building's security, the cameras, the two-man team on the street. She thought about the text and the phone call and the deliberate, patient methodology of a man who had spent 18 months building toward a moment. "Where?" she said. He gave her an address in the South End. A restaurant, again, public, at 8 p.m. "Come alone," he said, "or don't come at all." He hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand and made a decision she understood was either very smart or very dangerous. And she also understood that those two possibilities were not mutually exclusive either. She called Marco. "I need you to listen to me carefully," she said, "and I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing." A long pause. "Mrs. Vale?" "He called me," she said. "Voss, or someone representing him. He wants to meet. Tonight, 8 p.m., a restaurant in the South End." She paused. "I'm going." "Absolutely not," Marco said. "I'm going," she said again. "And you're going to put people in position without him knowing. I'm not going in blind. I'm going in with a wire and a team outside and your best read of every exit. But I'm going because right now I am the only leverage Damien has against Voss that Voss doesn't already know the value of." Damien doesn't know yet," she said. "And when he does, he's going to try to stop me. So we're going to do this before he does." Silence. "Marco," she said, "you called me the night of the island because you believed I could do something Damien couldn't do in that moment. I'm asking you to believe that again." The pause that followed was the longest she'd experienced. "I need 2 hours to set it up properly," Marco said. "You have 90 minutes, she said. She got to the restaurant at 7:55. It was smaller than the Seaport venue, intimate, badly lit in the way that was either atmospheric or deliberate, and she walked through the front door and scanned the room with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent 6 years reading environments for threat. He was already there, not what she'd expected, though she didn't know what she'd expected. Medium height, silver-framed glasses, a face that was more academic than dangerous, wearing a well-cut suit that had the particular European tailoring she'd seen on 3 of the men at the Sheridan dinner. He stood when she approached, which was a performance of civility she didn't trust for a second. "Mrs. Vale," he said, "thank you for coming." "You made it difficult to decline," she said, and sat down. She had been in the seat for approximately 4 minutes, long enough to order water, to scan the room again, to identify Marco's 2 people near the bar. When the door opened, she saw Marco's people shift before she turned around. When she turned around, she understood why. Damien was standing in the door of the restaurant. He wasn't looking at Voss. He was looking at her. And the expression on his face was not anger, or not only anger. It was the specific, fractured expression of a man who had arrived somewhere he hadn't expected. And what he found there had broken something open in him that all the control in the world was not currently capable of managing. Voss saw him at the same moment, and smiled. "Ah," Voss said pleasantly, settling back in his chair. "Now we're all here." And Evelyn understood, in the cold and clarifying way that she understood things when the stakes became real enough to burn off everything else, that this was not a conversation Voss had arranged with her. This was a trap he had arranged for Damien. She was the mechanism, just as she had been the mechanism from the beginning, except that this time the man who had built the mechanism was sitting across from her, and the man who had walked into the trap was standing in the door, and the question that sat between all 3 of them in that badly lit South End restaurant was no longer about contracts or leverage or the architecture of trust. The question was whether she was going to let herself be used as a weapon against the man who had used her first, or whether she was going to do something that no one in this room, not Voss, not Marco, and not even Damien himself had calculated for. The 3 seconds after Damien walked through the door were the longest Evelyn had ever lived through. She felt them in her body the way you feel a car accident, that stretched, elastic quality of time when everything slows to give you exactly enough space to understand how bad it is before it happens. Voss was smiling. Damien was standing in the doorway with rain on his shoulders and an expression she had never seen on his face before. Marco's 2 people at the bar had gone completely still in the way trained men go still when they're waiting for a signal that hasn't come yet. She made her decision in the space between one heartbeat and the next. She stood up, not toward Damien, toward Voss. She put both hands flat on the table and leaned forward and looked at Aldrich Voss from 8 inches away and said, quietly enough that it didn't carry beyond the table, "You have exactly 30 seconds to tell me what you actually want, not the version you prepared for an audience, the real one." Voss blinked. The smile held, but something behind it recalculated. "Sit down, Mrs. Vale," he said. "Your husband is—" "My husband is going to walk to that bar and order a drink and wait," she said, "because he trusts my read of the room. That's 30 seconds becoming 20. Talk." Voss looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of a man who has spent decades reading people and has just encountered a variable he didn't model. Then he looked past her at Damien, who had— she felt it without turning around, felt the shift in the room's temperature, stopped moving. "I want the Geneva accounts reversed," Voss said. "Flat, fast, stripped of performance. The access your husband obtained through the entity bearing your name allowed him to redirect $11 million from my operational reserve into accounts I cannot access. I want it returned. Or I release the documentation of the company bearing your name to every regulatory body currently investigating Damien's financial network," he said, "which will include you, your professional license, your clinic." A pause. "Your brother's newly arranged employment." She looked at him. "That's what you have," she said. "That's what I'm willing to use first," he said. She straightened up. She turned around. Damien was 6 feet away. He had moved without her hearing it, which meant he'd been moving from the moment she stood up, which meant he had, in fact, trusted her read of the room, or had at least trusted it enough to not blow the room up before she'd finished working it. She looked at his face. He looked at hers. The restaurant moved around them, oblivious. "He wants the Geneva money," she said. Damien's eyes moved to Voss. "Then he should have secured his network better," Damien said. Voss rose from the table. Unhurried, deliberate, the movement of a man who had decided that the performance phase of the evening was over. He was taller standing than he'd appeared sitting, close to Damien's height, though leaner, with the particular posture of someone who had learned to take up space through authority rather than physicality. 11 million, Voss said. 48 hours. Or every document I have about what this woman's name was used for gets filed simultaneously with the SEC, the Massachusetts Financial Regulatory Board, and 2 journalists who have been investigating your network for the past 18 months. He buttoned his jacket. "I've been patient with you, Damien. You took something that wasn't yours. I'm offering you an opportunity to correct that before it becomes a problem neither of us can manage." "You've been patient," Damien said, "for 9 years of having a man inside my organization feeding you operational intelligence, for 18 months of building toward a takeover you couldn't complete because I got there first." His voice was entirely level. "Call it what it is, Aldrich. You lost. This is the move of a man who's already lost and is trying to negotiate a version of the loss that lets him walk away intact." Something shifted in Voss's face. "Not much, but enough." 48 hours, Voss said. He looked at Evelyn. "It was a pleasure, Mrs. Vale." He moved toward the door. Damien didn't stop him. Evelyn stood in the middle of the restaurant and waited until Voss was through the door and the cold air from outside had stopped moving before she exhaled. Marco materialized at her elbow from somewhere she hadn't been tracking him. "He came with 2 people, Marco said, low and fast. "They're outside. They made our team." "Did they move?" Damien said. "No, they're walking." "Let them walk." Damien looked at Evelyn. "Are you all right?" It wasn't a gentle question. It was the question of a man running a rapid assessment. "I'm fine," she said. "We need to go somewhere and talk." "Yes," he said. "We do." The car ride back was 15 minutes of a silence so loaded it had physical weight. Marco sat in the front. Damien sat beside her in the back with 4 inches of space between them that felt like a fault line. She looked out her window. He looked out his. She could feel the heat of whatever he was containing from 2 feet away. The penthouse. The kitchen. Of course, the kitchen. She got there first. She turned on the light and stood at the island and waited for whatever was coming. He came in and closed the door to the hallway, not hard, but deliberately, and stood on his side of the island and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been holding something in for 40 minutes past the point where holding it was anything other than an act of pure will. "You called Marco without telling me," he said. "Yes?" You went to meet Voss without telling me. Yes, Evelyn. Her name in his mouth had the particular sound of a word that was carrying more than its syllables. He could have. I know what he could have done, she said. He didn't. And the reason he didn't is because I was there and I was the person he thought he was using, and that gave me information about what he actually wants that you wouldn't have gotten any other way. She met his eyes. I made a judgment call. I'd make it again. You should have told me. You would have stopped me. Yes, he said, I would have. Which is why I didn't tell you, she said, because stopping me would have been the wrong call. And you know it, and you're angry because you know it. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator made a sound. Outside the window, 40 stories down, the city moved. I'm angry, he said carefully, because I walked into that restaurant and saw you sitting across from a man who has had people killed, and the only thing standing between you and whatever he'd decided you were worth to him was a wire and 2 of Marco's people who he'd already made. I had more than that, she said. I had the fact that he needed me functional. You can't use a dead woman as leverage. Evelyn, I'm not being glib, she said. I'm telling you that I did the risk calculation before I walked through the door, the same way you do every time you walk into a room like that. You don't get to do it and call it strategy, and then watch me do it and call it reckless. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. This one had more room in it. He was listening. She could feel the quality of it. The Geneva accounts, she said. Is what he said accurate? 11 million? Yes, he said. Can you return it? Technically, yes. Are you going to? His jaw tightened. Returning it validates the threat. Every person in this network watches me return $11 million to a man who extorted me with a 48-hour deadline, and the next person who wants something knows exactly what mechanism to use. And if you don't return it, then we have 48 hours before the regulatory filings go out, and everything gets significantly more complicated. She looked at him. There's a third option, she said. Again. He looked back at her. You keep saying that, he said. You keep creating situations where it's true, she said. She told him what she'd seen in Voss's face at the table when she'd leaned forward. The recalculation. The specific quality of a man encountering a variable he hadn't modeled. She told him what Voss had said when she'd stripped the performance away. Fast, flat, unpolished. The real ask beneath the threat. He needs the money, she said. Not as a power move, genuinely. The Geneva operation didn't just damage his network. It destabilized something structural. The 11 million was load-bearing for him in a way that the threat doesn't reveal. She paused. He's not negotiating from strength. He's doing what desperate people do. He's making himself look stronger than he is and hoping you flinch first. Damien looked at her for a long moment. And if I'm wrong, she said, then we deal with the regulatory filings and you deal with the fallout. And I lose my license and we both survive it because that's what we do. Something moved through his face. Something she didn't have a word for yet. Go to bed, he said. I need to think. Damien, I'm not dismissing you, he said. I'm telling you that I need 4 hours to run this through every angle, and I need to do it without... He stopped. His hand moved, a small gesture toward the space between them. Without the distraction of you standing there being right about things. She looked at him. 4 hours, she said. Yes. Then I want to know the plan before you execute anything. A pause. Agreed. She went to bed. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the apartment. Footsteps, low voices that had to be Marco. The particular distant murmur of Damien on the phone, which she'd learned by now could mean anything from financial strategy to something she preferred not to examine too closely. And she thought about Voss's face and the 11 million and the 48 hours, and the particular sentence Damien had said in the kitchen, the distraction of you standing there being right about things. She was still turning that sentence over at 4:15 in the morning when her door opened. She sat up immediately. Old instinct. Damien stood in the doorway. He was still dressed. He looked like a man who had spent 4 hours doing exactly what he'd said, running every angle, and had arrived somewhere he needed to tell her about. Voss has a partner, he said. Financial. A man named Stahl, who runs legitimate fund management out of Frankfurt. Stahl has been the clean money laundering the operational funds for 8 years. He came into the room and stopped at the foot of the bed. Stahl doesn't know what the money actually is. Or he knew enough to look away. Either way, Stahl is the pressure point. If Stahl pulls his legitimate cover, she said, Voss loses the ability to represent himself in legitimate financial spaces, Damien said. Which means his threats about regulatory filings become much less credible. You can't file with regulatory bodies if you're about to become subject to them yourself. How do you get to Stahl? I already have, he said. I had a preliminary conversation with his legal team 2 hours ago. Stahl is uncomfortable with the nature of his relationship with Voss. He's been looking for a mechanism to exit it cleanly. You offered him one. I offered his legal team a conversation about what a transition away from Voss's accounts would look like, with certain protections in place. He paused. He took the meeting. She looked at him. When? Tomorrow morning. Frankfurt. He paused. I need you with me. She was very still. Why? Because the conversation I'm going to have with Stahl's people is going to require them to believe that the restructuring of the accounts is legitimate and above board, he said, which means they need to meet the person whose name was on the Geneva entity. They need to see that she's real, that she's informed, and that she's not a victim of anything. A pause. They need to see someone who made a decision and is standing behind it. Even though I didn't know, she said. Even though, he said, which is what I need to explain to you before I ask you to stand in that room. She waited. He sat down. On the edge of the bed, 3 feet from her, which was the closest he had been to her in this room since the night on the island that felt like a lifetime ago. What I did with your name, he said. I have said it was operational. I have not said it was right. He looked at his hands. I built a plan around your circumstances without your knowledge. I told myself it was because I couldn't risk the exposure if you declined. That was true. He paused. It was also true that I didn't want you to know what the operation was, because knowing it would have changed how you looked at me, and I had already, by the time we were sitting at that coffee shop, already started to care about how you looked at me. She listened. The contract was real, he said. Every term I offered you was genuine, but the architecture beneath it was something I built with my hands in your name, and I should have found another way, or I should have told you and let you say no. He looked up. I didn't. And I'm telling you now that I understand the difference between those two things. And I'm not asking you to reconcile them. I'm telling you because you deserve to have it said plainly, without me managing your response to it. The room was very quiet. Frankfurt, she said finally. Yes. You want me to stand in a room and represent a decision I didn't make as one I made willingly. I want you to stand in a room, he said carefully, as someone who knows the full truth now, and has decided, or not, what she's willing to do with it. He paused. That's not a manipulation, that's a question. She looked at him for a long moment. What does Stahl need to believe to pull away from Voss? She said. That the Geneva accounts were a legitimate transfer, that the entity is clean, that there's no exposure for him in the shift. Is that true? The entity is clean, he said. The transfer was legal by the letter of 3 different jurisdictions. A pause. The spirit of the thing is more complicated. It usually is, she said. She got up at 5. She packed a bag. She didn't explain it to herself too carefully because she'd found that the decisions that mattered most in her life had been the ones she stopped explaining before she talked herself out of them. They flew to Frankfurt. The meeting with Stahl's legal team was at 10 in the morning in a glass building in the financial district that looked exactly like every other glass building in every other financial district in every international city she'd never been to. 3 lawyers, 2 financial analysts, 1 man at the head of the table who she understood was Stahl himself. 60, careful, the kind of wealthy that had learned to look modest. Damien spoke for the first 20 minutes. She listened and watched faces and cataloged the specific language that produced tightening around the eyes, exposure, liability, documentation, and the specific language that produced the opposite, transition, protection, independent verification. When Stahl looked at her, which he did, twice, in the first 20 minutes, she held his gaze without expression. She was not performing reassurance. She was not performing authority. She was simply present in the way she was present with patients in her most difficult sessions, fully, without performance, without an agenda beyond accuracy. At the 23-minute mark, Stahl said, "Mrs. Vale, your name appears on documentation that represents a significant financial mechanism. Can you speak to your role?" She had decided on the plane what she was going to say. Not what Damien had suggested, not what the lawyers had outlined, not a performance of any kind. The truth, in the most useful configuration. "My name was placed on that documentation by my husband," she said. "I have since been fully briefed on its function and its legal standing. I've reviewed it with independent counsel." She looked at Stahl directly. "I'm here today because what happens with those accounts affects my name, and I've decided I'd rather be present in decisions that bear my name than absent from them." Stahl looked at her for a long moment. "And you're comfortable with the nature of the entity?" he said. "I'm comfortable with its legal standing," she said. "I'm present in this room because I've decided to be." She paused. "Is that the kind of answer you were looking for?" Something in Stahl's face shifted. He looked at Damien, then back at her. "Yes," he said quietly. "Actually, it is." The meeting concluded at 12:40. Stahl's lead attorney walked them to the elevator and said, in the measured language of someone delivering good news cautiously, that his client was prepared to begin the transition process within 30 days, subject to documentation review. In the elevator, going down, Damien stood beside her and said nothing. In the lobby, he said, "That was—" "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Not yet," she said. "I did that because it needed doing. We're going to have the rest of the conversation when we're back in Boston and the adrenaline has worn off and I can hear my own thinking again." "All right," he said. His phone rang. She knew from the way he answered it, one word, "Yes." And then the particular stillness she'd come to read as the body language of incoming damage. He listened for 40 seconds. He hung up. He turned to look at her, and what she saw in his face made her stomach drop. "Voss didn't wait for 48 hours, Damien said. "What did he do?" "He moved on the Boston operation directly," Damien said. "3 of our financial partners received simultaneous contact this morning. Documentation, account information, regulatory threats. 2 of them have already suspended their agreements." His jaw was hard. "And he sent people to the clinic." Her whole body went cold. "What do you mean he sent people to the clinic?" she said. "They were there when it opened this morning," Damien said. "They didn't go inside, they stood outside and one of your staff called Marco. Marco's people are there now." He paused. "But the message is clear." She was already moving toward the building's exit, toward the car, toward the airport, toward Boston, toward the building she had spent 6 years constructing from nothing, toward the patients inside it who had trusted her with their worst hours. Damien caught her arm. "The car is already coming," he said. "We'll be at the airport in 20 minutes, Boston in 8 hours. He didn't let go of her arm. "Evelyn?" She turned to look at him. "He's not going to touch the clinic," Damien said. "I will not let him touch the clinic." "You can't promise that," she said. "I can," he said. "Because this ends tonight." She looked at his face, the line of his jaw, the absolute flat certainty in his eyes, the particular expression of a man who has run out of the tolerance that kept him from doing what he's fully capable of doing. "What does tonight mean?" she said. "It means that Voss made a move before his deadline and gave up the only thing he had that I was willing to respect," Damien said. "The threat of regulatory exposure is a chess piece. It requires time, process, legal machinery. He tried to use it early because Stahl's departure panicked him." He paused. "A panicked man makes mistakes, and Voss just made his." "What mistake?" "What?" "He put people near my wife's clinic," Damien said, "in front of witnesses, in daylight." His voice was completely even. "He told me exactly how rattled he is." The car pulled up. They got in. The drive to the airport was 35 minutes, and she spent them on her phone. Marco, giving her a full situational report that she made him repeat twice to make sure she had every detail right. Her clinic manager, who she told to close early, go home, lock up, and not ask questions yet. Caleb, who answered on the first ring, and she told quickly and clearly that she needed him to stay where he was and not contact anyone until she reached him. Caleb said, "Evie, what is—" "I'll explain everything when it's over," she said. "Stay put, that's the one thing." "Okay," he said, which was the most useful thing he'd said in this entire situation. They boarded the jet at 2 p.m. Frankfurt time. The flight was 8 hours. She slept for 3 of them. Not peacefully, not voluntarily, just the shutdown of a body that had been running at operational capacity for too long and had found the first available pause. She woke up to find Damien sitting across from her, awake, a laptop open, 2 phones on the tray beside him, working through something with the focused, quiet intensity she'd seen in the Charlestown safe house. He looked up when she stirred. 3 hours out, he said. What's happened? Voss's 2 remaining financial partners have been contacted by my legal team, he said, with documentation of Voss's operational history that they were apparently not fully aware of. A pause. They're reviewing their positions. Marco? Has a location on Reeves, he paused. And on the 2 people Voss sent to your clinic this morning. She looked at him. What are you going to do with that? She said. He met her eyes. What needs to be done? Damien. She kept her voice level. I need you to understand what I'm able to know and what I'm not. He looked at her for a long moment. No one gets hurt who doesn't choose to be in the room, he said. That's all I'll tell you. She nodded. It was not a comfortable nodding. It was the nod of a woman who had made a series of decisions that had brought her to a place where that sentence was one she had to accept as the available truth. When we land, he said, I need you to go directly to Marco. He'll take you somewhere secure while I... No, she said. Evelyn, I'm not sitting in a safe house while this happens, she said. Not again. She held his gaze. I have been the mechanism in this situation from the beginning. I'm going to be present when it ends. You don't know what... I don't need to know exactly, she said. I need to be there. I need Voss to see me there. Do you understand why? He looked at her. Because if he sees you, Damien said slowly, he sees that using you didn't work. He sees that the people he thought were weapons are standing next to the man he was trying to destroy, she said. That's not a small thing. In the world you operate in, that's a statement. He was quiet for a moment. You're not wrong, he said. I know, she said. You're also terrifying, he said, not with fear, with something that lived close to wonder. Get used to it, she said. They landed at Logan at 9:40 p.m. Marco met them on the tarmac, grim, efficient, the compressed spring stillness that she'd learned meant the situation was active and serious. Voss is at the Meridian Hotel, Marco said, moving beside Damien as they walked to the cars. Penthouse floor. He has 6 people with him. Reeves is in a vehicle outside. He paused. 2 of our people are covering every exit. He's waiting, Damien said. He's waiting, Marco confirmed. He knows we're back. He's been tracking the flight. Damien looked at Evelyn. She looked back. Let's go, she said. The Meridian was 12 minutes from the airport, downtown, glass and steel, and the particular anonymous luxury of a hotel that catered to people who needed to be somewhere without being anywhere. The lobby was empty at 10 p.m. except for 2 desk staff and a security guard who Marco's people had, in some fashion she didn't examine, persuaded to find somewhere else to be. They went up in the elevator, Damien, Evelyn, Marco, and 2 of Marco's people whose names she didn't know and whose stillness she had learned to find reassuring rather than threatening. 42 floors. The elevator made no sound. She watched the numbers rise. She thought about a courthouse with fluorescent lights and a contract on a table. She thought about rain on Boston windows and a phone call that shattered a life cleanly in half. She thought about a beach at sunset and gray eyes that cost something to keep open. She thought about what she was willing to lose and what she wasn't. The elevator opened. The penthouse floor corridor was empty. Marco moved first with his 2 people, and she and Damien followed, and the carpet absorbed the sound of every footfall, and the whole floor had the particular held breath quality of somewhere that knew what was coming. Marco stopped outside the door at the end of the hall. He looked at Damien. Damien looked at Evelyn. She nodded. Marco knocked. A long silence. Then the door opened and Voss stood in the gap, and his face when he saw her standing beside Damien went through 3 separate expressions in under 2 seconds. Calculation, reassessment, and then something she recognized from 6 years of sitting across from people who had just run out of road. He had not expected this. Whatever he had prepared for, whatever scenario he had run, whatever version of this moment he had modeled, it had not included her here, standing, present, composed, with Damien's shoulder 3 inches from hers and no distance between them that looked anything like a vulnerability. "Evelyn," he said. Her first name, not her title. The move of a man trying to reestablish a dynamic that no longer existed. "Aldrich," she said, "we should talk." And behind her she felt Damien move. Not in front of her, not between her and Voss, not in the protective configuration she'd watched him default to for weeks, but beside her, shoulder to shoulder, which was something he had never done before, and which meant something she was going to think about later, when there was time to think about it properly. For now, there was only this door, and this man, and the 48 hours that had burned down to zero, and the question of whether everything she'd built inside a contract was strong enough to survive what happened next. Voss stepped back from the door, not retreating. The movement was too controlled for that, too deliberate. He stepped back the way a chess player moves a piece to a better square, creating space that he could manage, putting furniture and geometry between himself and the people he hadn't expected to be standing in his doorway together. Damien walked in first. Evelyn followed. Marco stayed in the hall with his people, and the door closed, and the three of them were alone in a penthouse suite that smelled like expensive scotch and old cigarette smoke that someone had tried to cover with the hotel's air system and mostly failed. The suite was large. A wall of windows showed Boston's nighttime skyline, the harbor lights, the bridge. 2 men were visible through a doorway to an adjacent room, Voss's people, who had straightened when the door opened and were now standing in that particular way of men waiting for a signal that hadn't come yet. "Tell them to sit down," Damien said. Voss looked at him. "Tell them," Damien said again, "or this is a different kind of conversation." Voss turned and said something in German. Both men sat. Evelyn crossed the room to the window. She stood with her back to the glass and the city behind her, and she looked at Voss and she waited. She had learned in 6 years of sitting across from people in the worst moments of their lives that the person who could wait longest in a room owned the room. She intended to own this one. "Stahl withdrew this afternoon," Voss said. He said it to Damien, not to her, which was its own kind of concession. He was no longer pretending she wasn't the more dangerous person to address. "I assume you know that." "I know that," Damien said. "Then you know the regulatory filing becomes significantly more complicated without his resources behind it," Voss said. "I'm not without other mechanisms, but the timeline extends." "The timeline extends to the point where it stops being a threat," Damien said. "Which you also know." Voss was quiet for a moment. He moved to the sideboard and poured 2 fingers of scotch and held it without drinking it. A prop. Something for his hands to do while his face stayed controlled. "What do you want?" Voss said. "I want you to say it out loud," Damien said. "In this room, to her." Voss looked at Evelyn for the first time since they'd entered. She looked back without expression. "Say what?" Voss said. "That you used her," Damien said. "That you pulled her brother into this deliberately through Rourke, who you'd been running as a secondary operation for 3 years before we ever dealt with him. That the debt Caleb Hart owed was not accidental. That it was constructed as a lever specifically because your intelligence on me, from Reeves, indicated that I had flagged her as relevant." The room was very still. Evelyn felt the information land in her chest like something with weight and temperature. She had known Voss had used her. She had not known he had built the mechanism that made her available to be used. She looked at Voss. "Caleb's debt?" she said. Her voice was completely steady. She was intensely proud of it. "Rourke was yours." Voss said nothing. "The gambling operation," she said, "the underground circuit. You ran it, or you ran someone who ran it. And my brother was in it. And when your intelligence told you I might be useful, you made sure his debt became the kind of debt that required a specific kind of help." Still nothing. "Did you know about him before?" she said. "Before you decided I was useful. Did you know he gambled, or did you create the opportunity and wait for him to find it?" Voss set his scotch down. "Your brother found the circuit on his own," he said. Flat, factual, stripped of performance. The debt escalated on its own. What we did was ensure that when he needed a way out, the way out led to a specific door. She looked at him for a long moment. "And Rourke's men outside my clinic," she said. "The card under my windshield. That was yours." "Pressure," he said, "to ensure the timeline moved appropriately. To ensure I was desperate enough by the time Damien made his offer That I wouldn't ask the questions I should have asked, she said. To ensure the arrangement happened quickly, Voss said. Yes. She looked at him. She thought about the night she had signed her name in a courthouse under fluorescent lights, exhausted and afraid and running out of road. She thought about what it had felt like to believe she was making a choice in desperation when the desperation itself had been manufactured. She thought about her brother's face in that Boston bar, scraped down to something she'd never heard before. You built it, she said. All of it. The pressure, the timeline, the specific shape of the crisis. You built it so that Damien would have a reason to use my name, and so that when he did, you would have leverage. A long game, Voss said, without apology, with the particular flat honesty of a man who has decided the performance is over, and the facts are the facts. Yes. How long? She said. From the point we identified you as a likely candidate, he said. Approximately 7 months. 7 months. She had been inside someone else's plan for 7 months before she'd walked into a coffee shop and thought she was making a decision with clear eyes. She breathed. She looked at Voss and she felt something move through her. Not the hot, immediate thing she'd expected. Not the explosion that might have been justified. Something colder, slower. The particular emotion of a woman who has understood something fully and is deciding what to do with the understanding. Thank you, she said. Voss blinked. For saying it plainly, she said. People rarely do. She turned to Damien. He was watching her with the expression she had come to understand was the one he couldn't manage. The open one. The one that lived in the place he didn't have a procedure for. He had known, she realized, what she was going to find out in this room. He had brought her here not because he needed her present for the confrontation, but because he needed her to hear it from the source, from the person who had built the original architecture. Because the truth about what had happened to her needed to come from somewhere outside Damien's control before she could decide what she believed about the parts that had been inside it. She understood that. She was going to think about it for a long time. The accounts, Damien said, turning back to Voss. The 11 million. I want it returned, Voss said. But the voice behind it was different now. Thinner. The voice of a man who has shown his hand and knows it. No, Damien said. Then nothing, Damien said. The regulatory filing doesn't move without stall. Your 2 remaining financial partners received documentation this morning that significantly complicates their willingness to be associated with you. Reeves is currently in a conversation with people who are considerably less patient than I am. He paused. You have no move left, Aldrich. What you have is a choice about how this ends. Voss looked at him. How does it end? He said. You pull your operation out of Boston, Damien said. Completely. Every asset, every contact, every secondary arrangement. You withdraw the regulatory documentation and you do not file it. Not now, not in 6 months, not ever. Because if you do, the information my legal team currently holds about the Rourke operation, which is documented, sourced, and ready, goes simultaneously to every authority with jurisdiction over your legitimate business interests in 3 countries. A pause. You walk away intact. Diminished, but intact. And in 6 months, when you've rebuilt enough to function, we don't know each other. The silence was very long. Voss looked at Evelyn. She held his gaze. And your wife? He said. She accepts this resolution. I'm standing here, she said. That's my answer. Another silence. Voss nodded. One short, precise movement. The nod of a man doing the math on the available options and finding only one that didn't end worse than this. The documentation will be withdrawn by morning, he said. My operation in Boston will be reduced within 30 days. Completely, Damien said. A pause. Completely. Damien turned to the door. Evelyn followed. She did not look back at Voss. There was nothing in that room she wanted a final image of. In the hallway, Marco read Damien's face and made 2 phone calls in rapid succession, his voice too low for her to hear. The elevator came. They went down 42 floors in silence, and the lobby was still empty, and the night air outside the Meridian hit her face like something she'd been waiting for without knowing it. Cold. Real. Boston in the early hours of the morning, the city doing what it always did, moving, breathing, indifferent to what had just ended in a room 42 floors above it. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her eyes closed. She felt Damien stop beside her. Are you all right? He said. No, she said, but I will be. She opened her eyes. "Take me home," she said. He did. The penthouse was dark when they arrived, the city spread out below the windows in its nighttime configuration, and she walked to the kitchen because the kitchen was where this had always happened between them. The real conversations, the accidental ones, the ones that mattered. And she turned on the light and stood at the island. He followed her. She looked at him across the surface that had functioned as a neutral zone for months now, and she felt the accumulated weight of everything this island had witnessed between them, and she thought that at some point the neutral zone had quietly stopped being neutral, and neither of them had called it. 7 months, she said. Yes, he said. You didn't know all of it, she said, when you made me the offer. You didn't know Voss had built the crisis around me. No, he said. I knew about Rourke's connection to a larger operation. I didn't know the specific construction of your brother's situation. I found out... He stopped. I found out 3 weeks into our marriage. A financial audit of Rourke's accounts surfaced the connection. And you didn't tell me. No, because if you told me, I might have left, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, she looked at him. This man who had entered her life through a door someone else had built, who had used her name without telling her, who had withheld information that changed the shape of every choice she'd made, who had put a blanket over her on a plane and made coffee and left it outside her door and held her hand under a table and stood beside her instead of in front of her at the end. You are a deeply complicated person, she said. Yes, he said. You've done things I don't entirely know how to absorb yet. I know. And somewhere in the middle of those things, she said, something happened that I also don't know how to absorb. And I need you to understand that those two things exist at the same time for me, and I'm not going to resolve them quickly, and I'm not going to pretend I can. He nodded. The contract, she said, in the safe. He looked at her. Get it, she said. He went to the study. She heard the safe open. He came back with a document she had signed in a courthouse under fluorescent lights on a cold Thursday in March, when she'd believed she was buying her brother's safety with 2 years of her autonomy. He put it on the island between them. She looked at it. She thought about this version of herself who had signed it, exhausted, afraid, clear-headed, in the particular way of someone who has no room left for anything but the decision directly in front of them. She thought about whether that version of herself had been manipulated or brave, and she arrived, after a long moment, at the conclusion that the answer was both, and that both could be true without canceling each other out. Tear it up, she said. He looked at her. Not because it's over, she said, because it was the wrong structure from the beginning. Whatever this is, she gestured at the air between them. It doesn't live in a contract. It never did. Tearing it up isn't ending something. It's stopping the pretense that a piece of paper could contain it. He picked up the document. He tore it once, cleanly. Then again. Then he set the pieces on the island between them, and they sat there in the kitchen light, and nothing legal bound them to anything anymore. I need time, she said, to process what Voss said, what you knew and when, all of it. I know, he said. I'm not leaving, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not going anywhere. But I need us to be honest about the fact that there are things I haven't finished being angry about. And I'm going to be angry about them, and that's not something you get to manage. I won't try to manage it, he said. You're going to want to, she said. That's what you do when things feel unresolved. You make them operational. You find a procedure. A pause. Yes. Don't, she said. Just be in it with me. That's what I need. He looked at her across the island, the torn contract between them, the city behind him through the windows, beginning very slowly to show the first gray edge of morning. I don't know how to do that, he said, honest in the way he'd been honest on the beach, the way that cost him something. I know, she said. I'll help you. The first weeks after the meridian were not easy. She hadn't expected them to be. She'd told patients for years that the end of a crisis was not the end of the work, that the body and mind that had been running on emergency fuel needed time to metabolize what had happened, and that the processing was slower and more uncomfortable than the crisis itself, and that this was normal, and that normal was not the same as okay. She applied this to herself with the same clear-eyed directness she applied to everything, which meant she was honest about the days when she couldn't look at Damien without feeling the cold weight of 7 months and a plan she hadn't been told about. She was honest about the days when that weight lifted and what was underneath it was something warmer and more real than anything the contract had ever articulated. She was honest about the fact that both of those days existed in the same week, sometimes in the same hour, and that she was not going to rush either of them toward resolution. She went back to the clinic. She saw her patients. She did the work that had kept her sane through everything, and she found that the clinic was still standing. Voss's people had not returned. The staff had not asked too many questions. The morning clients had arrived, and the afternoon clients had arrived, and the work had continued, which was what the work did. She had one conversation with Caleb that she had been putting off and finally had in the second week, in a coffee shop on Dartmouth. Not the one she and Damien had sat in that first morning, a different one that was only hers. She told him the full version, all of it, Rourke, Voss, the deliberately constructed crisis, the 7 months. Caleb sat across from her and listened with his hands flat on the table, the way he always went still when he was processing something serious. When she finished, he looked at his coffee for a long moment. "So my debt wasn't just bad luck," he said. "The debt was real," she said. "The choices that led to it were yours. What wasn't yours was the specific shape it took when it became a crisis." "That's a complicated distinction," he said. "Yes," she said. "Most true things are." He looked at her. "Are you okay?" "I'm working on it," she said. "And Damien?" She looked at her coffee. "Also working on it," she said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, "Evie, for what it's worth." He stopped, started again. "The morning I was in the penthouse, when you were at the clinic, he talked to me for 2 hours." He turned his cup in his hands, not about the operation or the money or any of it. "He asked me about you, what you were like growing up, what you wanted before the clinic, what you were afraid of." He paused. He asked like someone who needed to know, not to use it, just needed to know. She looked at her brother. "When did that conversation happen?" she said. "Second day," Caleb said. "Before the Geneva stuff. Before any of it." He met her eyes. "I'm not telling you what to do. That's what I saw." She nodded. She thought about it for a long time. On the 31st day after the meridian, she came home from the clinic at 7 to find the penthouse smelling like food, which was unusual enough that she stopped in the entryway and stood there for a moment before she understood that Damien was in the kitchen cooking something. She walked in. He was at the stove with his back to her, his jacket gone, sleeves rolled up, and he was doing something with a pan that involved considerably more heat than it probably needed. The counter beside him was occupied by a cutting board, 3 empty cans, and what appeared to be several decisions that hadn't fully cohered yet. She leaned against the doorframe. "What is that?" she said. He turned around. He looked for 1 second exactly like a man who had been caught doing something he wasn't certain about. "Pasta," he said. "It smells like a fire," she said. "The heat is—" He turned back to the pan and adjusted something. "It's under control." She watched him for a moment. This man who ran operations across 3 continents, who had sat across from Aldrich Voss without flinching, who had built an empire with his hands from a childhood that had given him nothing except the knowledge of what it felt like to have nothing. Standing in his kitchen making pasta with too much heat, because she'd mentioned once, in passing, in the second week they'd lived together, that she hadn't had a real home-cooked meal since her mother died. She crossed to the refrigerator and got out the bottle of wine that had been there for 2 days and found 2 glasses. "Move over," she said. He moved over. She stood beside him at the stove and adjusted the heat and looked at what he'd built and found that it was actually closer to food than she'd expected, and she added what it was missing and handed him the wine glass, and they cooked in the kitchen together for 35 minutes without talking very much, and the silence was the kind she'd learned, over months, to read accurately. This one was good. They ate at the kitchen island. The food was imperfect in the specific way of 2 people who had cooked it together. Slightly too much garlic, the pasta a minute over, something about the sauce that had gotten away from them somewhere around the 4th minute. And it was the best meal she'd had in longer than she could locate precisely. Halfway through, he said, "I spoke to a lawyer this week." She looked up. "About the legal entity," he said, "the Geneva Company. There are several steps required to fully dissolve it and remove your name from all associated documentation." He looked at his plate. "I've initiated the process. It will take approximately 90 days to complete." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "It should have been done before I asked anything else of you," he said. "Yes," she said, "it should have." A pause. "I'm also—" He stopped, set his fork down, looked at her with the gray eyes that she could read now in fine resolution, in the way you can read someone when you've watched their face across 100 different kinds of silence. "I've been making decisions in my life for 20 years on the basis of what was operationally sound," he said, "what was strategically optimal, what protected the structure I'd built." He paused. "I applied that to you. At the beginning, I told myself the structure of the contract was protection for both of us, and that was true. And it was also a way of not having to be honest about the parts that weren't operational." She waited. "I was afraid," he said, "of what it meant that I'd been watching you for 6 months before I ever spoke to you, of what it meant that the operation worked better because you had already become—" He stopped, made himself continue. "I didn't want to examine it honestly because examining it honestly would have required me to admit that I was already in something I hadn't agreed to and didn't know how to manage." She looked at him. "You could have just told me," she said. "I know," he said. "That first morning," she said, "in the coffee shop. You could have said, 'I've been paying attention to you for months, and I have a problem that involves your name, and I want to offer you something that solves both our situations, and I want to be honest with you about all of it, including the parts that don't make me look good.'" She paused. "I might still have said yes." "I know," he said. "That's the part I have to live with." She picked up her wine glass. She held it without drinking. "My mother used to say that the bravest thing a person could do was want something," she said. "Not work for it, not fight for it. Just want it, without apology, without the performance of not caring." She looked at the glass. She said most people spend their whole lives pretending they don't want the things they want because wanting something means it can be taken. He was listening. "I think you spent a long time being very good at not wanting things," she said. "And then something changed, and instead of saying what you wanted, you built a structure around it that let you have it without technically wanting it." She looked at him. "I understand why. I'm not sure I forgive it completely yet, but I understand it." He looked at her with the expression she had first seen on a beach at sunset and had been trying to accurately name ever since. She thought tonight that she finally had the word for it. Grateful. Not for the deal, not for the contract, not for the operational solution. Grateful in the way that was specific to people who had gone long enough without being genuinely seen, that being seen felt like something they didn't entirely deserve and couldn't quite believe was still happening. "What do you want?" she said. "Right now, without the structure, without the procedure, what do you actually want?" He was quiet for a long time. "This," he said, "exactly this. The kitchen and the terrible pasta and you," he stopped. "You knowing the worst of it and still being in the room." She set her wine glass down. She reached across the island and put her hand over his. Not dramatically, not as a statement, just her hand on his, which was what it was. He looked down at it, then at her. "I'm still angry," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm going to be angry for a while." "I know," he said. And I'm staying," she said. "I want to be clear about that too. Not because of anything the contract said. Not because of what you can offer me, because this—" She turned his hand over and held it properly. "This is real. Even the parts that started wrong. Even the parts I'm still sorting through. The thing between us is real, and I'm not willing to walk away from real things." He closed his hand around hers. He didn't say anything, which was the right call. Some moments didn't need to be responded to with language. He had been learning, slowly and imperfectly, which moments those were. The city moved below the windows. The kitchen light was warm. The wine was half finished, and the pasta was cold, and none of it mattered at all. 6 months later, they went back to the island. It was late October, and the Caribbean was moving into its best season. The air still warm, but the humidity softened, the light at golden hour coming in at the particular angle that made everything look like a memory you wanted to keep. They arrived on a Thursday afternoon, and she stood on the terrace where she'd stood the first time and felt the difference between the two moments like a physical sensation in her chest. Same ocean, same light, same man standing somewhere behind her. Different everything else. The estate was smaller with people in it. Not many. Caleb was there, tan from his first 3 months of genuine stability at the Harlan Group, quieter than she'd known him and better for the quiet. Two of Damien's people who were, she had come to understand over months, less employees than something closer to the only family he'd been willing to build before her. Marco, who had taken approximately 4 months to relax around her by approximately 4%, which she considered a victory. There was no ceremony. She had been firm about that. Whatever they were going to do on this island, it was not going to be an event. It was going to be a conversation between two people who had been through a particular kind of fire and had come out the other side knowing exactly what they were to each other. They went down to the beach at sunset without announcing it to anyone. She carried her shoes. He carried nothing, which was unusual enough for him that it still meant something. The sand was warm and the water was the particular shade of blue-green that didn't photograph right, that only existed when you were standing in front of it. She stopped at the edge of the surf. He stopped beside her. "You know what I think about?" she said. The water came in cold over her feet. "What?" "The courthouse," she said. "That clerk. The fluorescent lights." She paused. "I signed my name and I thought I was making the most transactional decision of my life. And I was scared and I was exhausted and I thought I was closing a door behind me." She looked at the water. "I didn't understand that I was opening one." "Neither did I," he said. "Not fully." She looked at him sideways. "You had a plan." "I had an operation," he said. "I didn't have a plan for this." "No," she said. "Neither did I." The waves came in. The sun was nearly at the waterline, painting everything the same amber it had been that first evening, when she'd stood on the terrace and felt something in her chest unclench that she hadn't known was clenched. She turned to face him. "I have something to tell you," she said. He looked at her. His face was open in the way that still cost him something. She knew it still cost him. She could see the slight effort of it. And she loved him for keeping it open anyway. "I found out 3 days ago," she said. "I've been trying to figure out how to tell you. I kept starting sentences and then not finishing them, which is unusual for me." She paused. "I'm pregnant." The ocean moved around them. He was very still. Not the controlled stillness, not the managed stillness, not any of the varieties of stillness she'd cataloged in months of watching him contain things. This was a different kind entirely. The stillness of a man whose entire system had just received something it didn't have a category for and had gone quiet trying to build one. She watched it move through his face, not cleanly, not gracefully, the way real things move through people when they have nowhere else to go. Visibly, without management, in the involuntary language of someone who has been genuinely caught off guard by something that matters. His jaw moved. His eyes, when he looked at her, were not the gray she'd spent months reading. They were something she didn't have a previous version of. "Say something," she said, gently. He stopped. "Damien, give me—" He put his hand over his mouth briefly and looked at the water, and she saw his shoulders move with a breath that was not controlled at all. She waited. He turned back to her, and she saw that whatever the thing was on his face, it was not something he was going to find language for quickly. He reached for her hand. He held it the way he'd held it under the negotiating table. Not a performance, not a signal for anyone else. Just the physical fact of his hand around hers, because it was what he needed his hand to be doing. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed it there for a moment, and she felt the warmth of it and the slight tremor that he probably didn't know was visible. And she thought about everything they had been to each other in the months between signing a contract and standing barefoot in Caribbean surf, and she understood that there was no clean way to account for it. The damage and the real thing had grown up together, tangled, inseparable. You couldn't extract the clean history because there wasn't one. There was only what had happened and what had become, and the person she was standing in front of and what she felt. He lowered her hand. He looked at her face in the last of the day's light. "Evelyn," he said, her name in his mouth. The way he said it had changed over months in a way she couldn't have specified. Warmer, like it meant more now than it had when he'd first used it, like it had accumulated meaning, the way all words did when you said them enough in the right context. "Are you—" He stopped. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "And do you—" He stopped again. He pressed his mouth together. "Do you want—" "Yes," she said. "Very much." He exhaled. And then, in a movement she had never seen from him and would carry with her for the rest of her life, he bent down. Not dramatically. Not the grand gesture. He sat down on the wet sand in his good clothes with the surf coming in around his shoes, and he wrapped both arms around her waist and pressed his face against her and held on with the specific grip of someone who has been given something they genuinely did not expect to ever have and cannot find a more appropriate response than this. She stood in the fading light and held onto his shoulders and felt him breathe. Not controlled, not managed, not operational, just breathe in and out. A man who had survived things by never allowing himself to need anything, learning, for the first time, what it felt like when the thing he needed was standing right here. The water came in around them. The last of the sun dropped below the horizon. She looked out at the ocean over his head and thought about a phone call at 4 a.m. and a courthouse on a Thursday, and a coffee that had been left outside her door, and a hand held under a table and a blanket on a plane, and the specific quality of a man's face when he had been caught being honest. She thought about her mother's hands, and her brother's voice scraped thin, and the fluorescent lights, and the pen in her fingers, and the particular moment she had understood that some things couldn't be fixed, and some things could. This could. This wasn't what she'd signed up for. It wasn't clean. It wasn't the arrangement either of them had designed, or the story either of them would have written for themselves, starting from a blank page with unlimited options. It was what had happened instead. Built from desperation and calculation, and the particular accident of two people in proximity long enough to see past the performance of each other, and what had been there was real, and real was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. He stood up eventually with wet sand on his knees and the ocean on his shoes, and she put her hand against his face and looked at him in the last light, and he looked back at her without managing any of it, without a procedure, without a structure, without anything between his face and what he felt. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Not about the child. About all of it. The whole shape of a life that had just rearranged itself permanently." "I know," she said. "We'll figure it out." "You're certain?" "I've never been less certain of anything," she said. "We'll figure it out anyway." He put his forehead against hers. The ocean moved around their feet. Behind them, up at the house, there was light in the windows and the sound of people she had chosen and people he had finally let himself have. She closed her eyes. The waves came in and went out and came back, the same as they always had and always would, indifferent to what two people had survived to be standing here in their reach. She didn't need the ocean to care. She had this. She had him. She had what came next. That was enough. That was everything.